The throne room of Blackthorn Kingdom smelled the way power always smells when it starts to rot. Old stone, burning pine resin, and the faint copper tang of dried blood that no servant could ever fully scrub from the cracks between the floor tiles. 7 months had passed since the last battle of the Western Reach, and the kingdom still wore its scars like medals. Collapsed watchtowers along the northern ridge. Mass graves outside of the capital walls covered in wildflowers that nobody had planted. Widows who stopped screaming months ago but still walk through the market with that hollow stare, like someone had scooped out the part of them that knew how to feel and left the rest standing upright out of habit. Luna Morel stood at the far window of the queen's chamber, pressing her forehead against glass so cold it burned. Below, the capital city of Ashenmere sprawled in every direction. Smoke from 10,000 chimneys, torchlit streets, the distant howl of wolves in the pine forest that bordered the eastern wall. She could see everything from here. The view was supposed to make her feel powerful. Tonight it just made her feel like a woman watching her own funeral from very far away. Her reflection stared back at her in the dark glass. 31 years old, thinner than she should be, cheekbones too sharp, circles under her eyes the color of bruised plums. Her dark hair was still damp from the bath, hanging in heavy ropes past her shoulders, dripping onto the stone floor in a rhythm that sounded like a clock running out of time. She had not eaten since yesterday morning. She had not slept in 4 days. Behind her, the oak door groaned open and footsteps crossed the room. Heavy boots, confident stride. The kind of walk that belonged to a man who had never once doubted whether he deserved to be exactly where he was. Kyle Draven, Alpha King of Blackthorn, her husband, the man she had followed into a war that killed 60,000 wolves and broke every alliance south of the Grey Mountains. The man who once grabbed her face with both hands in the middle of a battlefield, blood running down his jaw, and said the words she had carved into the bone of her chest like scripture. "You are the only thing in this world I would burn a kingdom to keep." He did not look at her now. He crossed to the oak table near the fireplace, poured himself a drink from the crystal decanter, and stood there with his back to her, rolling the glass between his palms like he was deciding something. The firelight caught the edge of his jaw, the thick scar that ran from his left ear to his collarbone, the way his shoulders had started to hunch forward in the last few weeks, like a man carrying something invisible and very heavy. Luna watched his reflection in the window glass. She waited. She had become an expert at waiting. "You missed the council session," she said. Her voice came out flatter than she intended. No accusation, no heat, just a woman stating a fact the way you might say it rained today or the bread is stale. She had learned months ago that showing emotion in front of Kyle was like bleeding in open water. Something always came swimming. Kyle took a long drink, set the glass down, still did not turn around. "I had matters to attend to," he said. Matters. Luna let the words sit in the air between them. She knew exactly what matters meant. She had known for 11 days, ever since the night Commander Thorne had pulled her aside in the corridor outside the war room and spoken to her in that careful, measured voice that powerful men use when they are about to deliver news that will gut you, but they want to pretend it is routine. The woman, Celine Voss, former lover of the Alpha King, supposedly vanished 3 years ago during the siege of Greyhallow. Supposedly dead. Supposedly nothing more than a ghost story whispered by old soldiers around campfires. Except ghosts do not show up at the palace gates 8 months pregnant, wearing a white fur cloak and a smile like she already owned the place. Luna turned from the window. She crossed the room until she was close enough to see the tension in Kyle's neck, the way a muscle jumped in his jaw, the fact that he still would not meet her eyes. "Look at me," she said. "Luna, look at me, Kyle." He turned. And there it was. That expression she had been seeing more and more in the last 2 weeks. Not anger, not even guilt. Something worse. Distance. Like he was already standing on the other side of a door that he had decided to close and was just waiting for her to notice. She searched his face the way she used to search enemy terrain before a battle, reading every shadow, every line, looking for the trap she knew was there. Where was she today, she said. Which wing? Kale exhaled through his nose. The South Tower. Healer Marin is monitoring the pregnancy. The child is... I did not ask about the child. The words came out harder than she planned. A crack in the wall she had been building around herself for 11 days. She saw something flicker across Kael's face. Surprise, maybe, or irritation. It was getting harder to tell the difference. The council wants updates, he said. The bloodline question matters to them. The bloodline question. Luna almost laughed. Almost. She caught it in her throat and swallowed it back down because laughing right now would mean breaking, and breaking right now would mean losing the only thing she had left in this palace, the appearance of control. You mean the question of whether your former lover is carrying a pure alpha heir, she said. That bloodline question. Kael's jaw tightened. Do not make this into something it is not. Then tell me what it is. It is politics. It is the survival of this kingdom. The council has been pressing for an heir with pure alpha blood since the day I took the throne, and you know that. You have always known that. There it was, the knife she had been waiting for. Not buried in her back the way she had expected, but handed to her openly, almost casually, like he was offering her a glass of water. Here. This is the thing that is going to kill you. Hold it yourself. It is easier that way. Luna felt something shift inside her chest. Not a break. Not yet. More like the sound a frozen lake makes just before the ice gives way. A deep, structural groan that you feel in your teeth. I gave you 7 years, she said. Her voice was quiet now. Dangerously quiet. The kind of quiet that comes right before a storm flattens a forest. I stood beside you when you were nothing. When you were a disgraced thirdborn with no claim and no army, and every alpha in the Western Reach wanted your head mounted on a pike. I recruited the Ashfall Wolves when nobody else would ride into those mountains. I held the Northern Pass for 9 days with 40 fighters while you flanked the enemy at Grey Hallow. 9 days, Kael. I ate horse meat and melted snow and watched men die in the mud because I believed you when you said this would mean something. That we would mean something. She took a step closer, close enough now to smell the whiskey on his breath, the pine soap on his skin, and underneath it all, something else. Something faint and floral that did not belong to this room or to her. Celine's perfume. Luna's stomach turned. She locked her knees and kept standing. And now a woman walks through the gates with a swollen belly and a convenient story, she said, and suddenly the 7 years I gave you are worth less than an unborn child who may or may not carry your blood. Kael moved fast. He grabbed her arm, not hard enough to bruise, but hard enough to make the point that he was done letting this conversation drift. She is carrying my child, he said. The healers confirmed it. The bloodline markers are clear. I did not choose this, Luna. I did not plan it. But this kingdom needs what that child represents, and if you cannot see past your own what? Say it. Kael stopped. His grip loosened. He let go of her arm and stepped back, and Luna watched something close behind his eyes, like a gate slamming shut. I am not your enemy, he said. His voice was quieter now. Controlled. The voice of a king instead of a husband, and that distinction burned worse than anything else he had said tonight. This situation is complicated. I need you to trust me. Trust you. Luna held his gaze for a long moment. Then she looked down at her arm where his fingers had been. 4 faint red marks on her skin. She stared at them the way you stare at evidence of something you always feared but never wanted confirmed. The last time you asked me to trust you, she said, I followed you into a war. I wonder what it will cost me this time. She walked past him and out the door. Her bare feet made no sound on the stone corridor. Behind her, she heard Kael pour himself another drink, and the sound of crystal against crystal was the loneliest thing she had ever heard. The palace corridor stretched ahead of her, lit by torches that threw long shadows on the walls. Tapestries depicting the Blackthorn lineage hung between every arch. Stern-faced alphas with golden eyes, their queens positioned slightly behind them, slightly smaller, like afterthoughts stitched into the margins of someone else's story. Luna had walked past these tapestries 1,000 times. Tonight she stopped and looked at them, really looked. Every queen in the Blackthorn line had the same expression, composed, pleasant, empty. Women frozen in thread with their mouths closed and their hands folded, existing only as proof that the man beside them had once chosen them. Is that what I look like to them, she thought. A decoration that can be taken down and replaced when the colors fade. She kept walking. The South Tower was on the opposite end of the palace, past the Great Hall and the council chambers, and the kitchens where the night staff would be banking the ovens and scraping grease from iron pots. Luna did not go to the South Tower. She went down instead, through a narrow staircase that the servants used, down into the lower corridors, where the air was colder and the torch flames guttered in drafts that smelled like earth and wet stone. She found Marin in the healer's study. The old woman was bent over a table covered in dried herbs and glass vials, her silver hair braided down her back, her fingers stained green from whatever she had been grinding. Marin had served the palace for 40 years. She had set Luna's broken wrist after the Battle of the Ash River. She had brewed the tonic that kept Luna standing during the 9-day siege when her body tried to collapse from exhaustion. If there was one person in this palace who still looked at Luna and saw a human being instead of a political problem, it was Marin. The healer looked up when Luna entered. Her expression tightened, just for a second, just enough for Luna to catch it, before settling into practiced neutrality. "My queen," Marin said, "it is late." Luna closed the door behind her. She leaned against it and crossed her arms because her hands were shaking and she needed them to stop. "Tell me about the bloodline test," she said. Marin set down her mortar and pestle. She wiped her hands on her apron slowly, deliberately, the way people move when they are buying time to decide how much truth they can afford. "The markers were consistent with alpha lineage," Marin said carefully. "Consistent with?" Marin hesitated. Her eyes moved to the closed door, then back to Luna. "Consistent with alpha lineage," she repeated. "That is what I reported to the council." Luna watched the old woman's face. 40 years of service had taught Marin how to say exactly what was required, and nothing more. But Luna had spent 7 years learning to read the spaces between words the way a tracker reads the spaces between footprints, and right now those spaces were screaming. "What did you not report to the council?" Luna said. Marin was quiet for a long time. The candle on her table flickered. Somewhere above them, footsteps crossed the ceiling. Palace guards on their midnight rotation. "There are certain markers," Marin said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "that I would need to examine more closely. The initial test confirms alpha blood. But the specific lineage, whose alpha blood, that requires a deeper analysis. One the council did not request. One I was specifically told not to perform." Luna felt the ground shift under her feet. Not literally, but close enough. The kind of shift that happens when something you suspected in the dark part of your gut suddenly gets spoken out loud and becomes real. "Who told you not to perform it?" she said. Marin looked at her, and in that look, Luna saw something she had never seen in the old healer's eyes before. Fear. "You should go to bed, my queen," Marin said. "It is late, and these are questions better left for daylight." Marin. "Please." Marin's hands were trembling now. "Please, Luna. There are things happening in this palace that I do not understand, and I am too old and too tired to be brave. Go to bed, lock your door, and be very, very careful about who you trust." Luna stared at her for a long moment. Then she nodded once, pushed off the door, and left without another word. She did not go to bed. She went to the only place in the palace where she had ever been able to think clearly. The rooftop garden above the eastern wing, where the wind came howling down from the mountains, and the cold was savage enough to strip everything away except the raw machinery of thought. She sat on the stone bench between 2 dead rose bushes. Dead because winter had come early this year and nobody had bothered to cover them. And she pressed her palms against the frozen stone and let the cold burn into her skin until her mind stopped spinning and locked into place like a blade sliding into its sheath. Facts. She needed facts. Celine Voss had returned after 3 years, 8 months pregnant, claiming the child was Kael's. The healers confirmed alpha blood but were told not to test the specific lineage. Someone with authority had ordered that test suppressed. The council was celebrating the pregnancy like it was a divine event. And Kael, the man who had sworn oaths to her in blood and fire, was already pulling away, repositioning himself, making room for a woman he once swore meant nothing to him. Luna exhaled and watched her breath turn to white smoke in the freezing air. She had survived wars. She had survived starvation and betrayal, and 9 days of hell on a frozen mountain pass with arrows falling like rain. She had survived because she understood one fundamental truth about power that most people learn too late. Power does not care about loyalty. Power does not care about sacrifice. Power is a river, and it flows toward whatever channel is deepest, And right now, that channel was a pregnant woman in the South Tower with a smile like a closed door and eyes that calculated everything they touched. Luna knew she should be angry. She was angry, but underneath the anger was something colder and more useful. The same icy clarity she had felt on the 9th day of the siege, when her body was broken and her fighters were dying, and she looked at the enemy line and saw the gap nobody else could see. The gap that won them the battle. The gap that eventually won them the war. There was a gap here, too. She could feel it. Something in Celine's story did not fit. Something about the timing, the convenient reappearance, the suppressed blood test. It was like looking at a battlefield map and noticing that one ridge was drawn slightly wrong, not enough for most people to catch, but enough for someone who had spent 7 years learning to see what power tries to hide. She needed more information. She needed allies. And she needed to move quietly, because whatever was happening in this palace, the people behind it had already started building the walls around her. And if she was not careful, she would wake up one morning and find that the cage was complete. The wind screamed across the rooftop. Luna closed her eyes and let it hit her face. Cold like a slap. Cold like truth. "I am not finished," she whispered to no one. "You do not get to erase me that easily." 3 days passed. 3 days of watching. 3 days of smiling at court functions and nodding at council meetings and pretending she did not notice the way the entire palace had begun to rearrange itself around a woman who had been dead for 3 years and was now very much alive and very much the center of everything. Celine Voss moved through the palace like she had been born in it. She had a way of entering a room that made everyone in it feel like they had been waiting for her without knowing it. A slow, measured grace that was nothing like the raw efficiency Luna had learned from years on campaign. Where Luna was sharp angles and calloused hands, and the kind of beauty that looked like it had been earned in a fight, Celine was soft curves and polished skin and a voice like warm honey poured over a blade. Luna watched her from across the great hall during the evening meal. Celine sat at the high table now. Not in the queen's seat, not yet, but close enough to make the statement obvious. She wore a deep burgundy gown that draped over her pregnant belly like it had been designed by someone who understood exactly how to weaponize vulnerability. Her dark hair was piled high on her head, and she laughed at something Chancellor Aldrich said with a lightness that made Luna's stomach turn because it was so perfectly calibrated. Not too loud, not too familiar. Just enough to make the old man feel important while signaling to everyone in the hall that she belonged at that table more than the woman watching from the other end. Kael sat between them. He was talking to Commander Thorne about the border patrols, but his body was angled towards Celine, and every few minutes his hand drifted to the back of her chair in a gesture so small and so unconscious that Luna wondered if he even knew he was doing it. He used to do that with me, she thought, his hand on my chair, his body angled toward mine, like gravity. She looked down at her plate. She had not touched the food. Roasted venison and root vegetables in a dark sauce that smelled like rosemary and wine. Her appetite had disappeared 11 days ago and had not come back. "You should eat," said a voice beside her. Luna turned. Lady Vera, the youngest member of the Royal Council, was sitting to her left, mid-20s, sharp jaw, sharper tongue. The only council member who had voted against Celine's formal welcome into the palace, which made her either brave or stupid. In Luna's experience, those two things were usually the same. "I am fine," Luna said. "You look like death wearing a crown," Vera said, keeping her voice low. "And I mean that with all the respect I can manage, which tonight is not very much. Have you slept this week?" Luna almost smiled. "Almost. Have you found anything?" she said quietly. Vera glanced across the hall. Her eyes moved to Celine, then to Chancellor Aldrich, then to the two council members seated nearest the high table. Lord Fenwick and Lady Moreau, both of whom had been vocal supporters of recognizing Celine's unborn child as the official alpha heir. "I sent a rider to Greyhallow," Vera said, barely moving her lips. "Discreet. Merchant cover. He should be back within the week. If Celine was truly there during the siege 3 years ago, someone will remember. If she was not," Vera paused, "then the question becomes where she actually was and who she was actually with." Luna nodded. The venison was going cold on her plate. She picked up her fork and forced herself to take a bite because Vera was right. Not eating was a weakness she could not afford right now. And the meat tasted like nothing, like chewing leather. like her body had decided that survival was the only function left, and pleasure was a luxury for people who still had something to hope for. Across the hall, Celine caught Luna's eye and smiled. It was not a cruel smile. That was the worst part. It was warm, open, almost sisterly. The kind of smile a woman gives another woman when she wants everyone watching to see how gracious she is, how generous, how willing to share the spotlight with the poor creature she is about to replace. Luna held the smile. She held it like holding a live coal, tight enough that her hand did not shake, loose enough that it did not burn through. 1 week, she told herself. Vera's rider will be back in 1 week. Until then, you smile, you eat, you breathe, you survive. She had been surviving her whole life. She was very good at it. But surviving is not the same as living, and somewhere in the deepest part of her chest, in the place where she kept the things she would never say out loud, Luna could feel the difference widening like a crack in a wall, and she did not know how much longer the wall could hold. The next morning brought the first real blow. Luna was crossing the courtyard toward the council chambers when she heard the drums. Not war drums, celebration drums. The deep, resonant boom of the ceremonial blackthorn drums that were only played for announcements of royal significance, births, deaths, victories, the naming of heirs. She stopped in the middle of the courtyard. Servants rushed past her on either side, moving toward the great hall with the frantic energy of people who have been told to prepare for something important and given no time to do it. Kitchen staff carrying platters, housekeepers with armfuls of fresh linen, a stable boy dragging a brass candelabra that was taller than he was. Luna grabbed the arm of a passing maid, a young girl, 16 maybe, with flour on her cheeks and terror in her eyes. "What is happening?" Luna said. The girl stared at her. Then something passed across the girl's face, pity, maybe, or embarrassment, and she pulled her arm free and stammered an answer that hit Luna like a fist to the sternum. "The king has called a feast tonight, my queen, to formally welcome Lady Celine into the royal household and to announce the council's recognition of the unborn child as an heir of Blackthorn blood. The seamstress has been ordered to prepare a gown for Lady Celine. The girl swallowed. The council has approved the announcement unanimously." Unanimously. Luna let the word settle. She thought of Vera, who had voted against Celine's welcome. Unanimously meant Vera had been overridden, or pressured, or both. The maid hurried away. Luna stood alone in the courtyard with the drums beating in her ears and the cold morning air burning her lungs and the very clear, very sharp understanding that everything she feared was happening faster than she had prepared for. She went to find Heir. Not because she expected him to listen. Not because she thought she could change what was already in motion. She went because she needed to look into his eyes one more time and know for certain whether the man she married was still in there or whether the kingdom had already swallowed him whole. She found him in the armory. He was standing in front of the weapons rack with his shirt off, examining a fresh bandage on his ribs, a wound from the war that had never fully healed and still opened when he trained too hard. Sweat glistened on his skin. The scar on his neck was vivid in the morning light, and for one brutal, unwanted second, Luna remembered the night she had stitched that wound by candlelight while he bit down on a strip of leather to keep from screaming. She remembered the way he had looked at her afterward, like she was the entire world compressed into a single person, and she had to clench her jaw to keep the memory from splitting her open. "A feast," she said. Heir did not look surprised to see her. He did not look much of anything. He pulled a clean shirt over his head and began fastening the buttons with the mechanical efficiency of a man going through motions he could do in his sleep. "The council decided," he said. "Not me. The council does not light the drums without the king's command. That is Blackthorn law. You know it. I know it. Do not treat me like a fool, Heir." He stopped buttoning. His hands hung at his sides. For a moment, just a moment, she saw something flash across his face, something that looked almost like pain, almost like the man she used to know. Then it was gone. "The kingdom needs stability," he said. "The wars cost us half our fighting force and most of our treasury. The northern clans are restless. The council believes a recognized heir will unify the factions, and what about me?" The question hung between them like a blade. Heir finally looked at her, directly, and Luna saw it. The thing she had been afraid to see since the night Celine walked through those gates. He was not being manipulated. He was not confused. He had already decided. He had already chosen the path, and she was not on it, and every conversation they had from this point forward was just the slow administrative process of making her disappearance official. "You are still queen," he said. "Nothing changes that." But even as he said it, they both knew it was a lie. The kind of lie that sounds true long enough for the person telling it to leave the room. Luna stared at him for a long time. She memorized his face the way a soldier memorizes the map of a place they are about to abandon. Every ridge, every valley, every shadow. Because she understood with absolute clarity that she was looking at this man for one of the last times before whatever they had been to each other finished dying. "I remember the night before the Battle of Ashfall," she said. Her voice was steady now. Calm in the way that a blade is calm right before it cuts. "You could not sleep. You were shaking, not from cold, from fear, because you knew the morning would bring the largest enemy force we had ever faced, and you did not believe we could win." "Do you remember what I said to you?" Cale said nothing, but she saw his throat move. "I said that the world would try to take everything from us," she continued, "and that I would stand beside you even when there was nothing left to stand on. And I did, Kael. I stood on mud and blood and broken bones, and I did not leave. I did not waver. I did not flinch. And I need you to remember that tonight, when you are standing beside her at that feast, celebrating the thing that is going to bury me, I need you to remember exactly what kind of loyalty you are throwing away." She turned and walked out of the armory. Her spine was iron. Her eyes were dry. And inside her chest, in the place where her heart used to beat with absolute faith in the man she had just left standing alone with his unbuttoned shirt and his half-healed wound, something finally cracked all the way through, and the sound it made was silence. The feast began at sundown. Luna dressed herself. No handmaids. She had dismissed them an hour ago because she could not stand the way they looked at her, with that particular blend of pity and calculation that servants develop when they sense the power shifting and begin to recalculate which side of the door they need to be standing on when it closes. She chose a black gown. Simple. High-necked. No jewelry except the thin silver band on her left ring finger. The bonding ring Kael had given her the night they formalized their union. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw a woman dressed for a funeral that nobody else would acknowledge. Good, she thought. Let them see exactly what this is. The great hall was transformed. Torches in every sconce. Fresh pine boughs draped over the rafters, filling the air with a sharp green scent that mixed with the smell of roasting meat and spilled wine. The long tables were packed with every lord, lady, commander, and council member in the capital. Voices bounced off the stone walls in a roar of conversation and forced laughter that sounded, to Luna's ears, like the noise an animal makes when it is trying to convince itself the cage is comfortable. She entered through the side door. Nobody announced her. 6 months ago, the herald would have struck the floor with his staff and called her name. Luna Morel, Queen of Blackthorn, holder of the Northern Pass, Shield of Ashfall. Tonight the herald was busy adjusting the flowers at the high table where Celine would sit. Luna took her seat, the chair at the far end of the high table, not beside Kael. That seat was empty, reserved for the woman who would enter last because the entire evening had been choreographed to make that entrance the only thing anyone remembered. Vera appeared beside her. The young councilwoman looked like she had not slept either. There was a bruise-colored shadow under her left eye and a tightness in her jaw that Luna recognized, the look of someone who has been outmaneuvered and knows it. "They pressured you," Luna said quietly. Vera poured wine into both their cups. "Unanimous vote," she said. Fenwick had the numbers. Moreau backed him. The others fell in line because falling in line is what cowards do when the wind changes. Your rider. Still out. 5 more days, maybe 4 if the roads hold. Luna nodded. She picked up her wine and took a long drink. It was bitter and warm and tasted like the only honest thing in the room. The drums sounded. The hall fell silent. Every head turned toward the main doors. Celine Voss entered the great hall the way a conqueror enters a captured city, slowly, savoring every step, giving the crowd time to absorb what they were seeing. She wore white. Of course she did. Pure white silk that flowed over her pregnant belly and pooled on the floor behind her like snow. Her hair was loose, black as ink, falling past her waist. A thin gold circlet sat on her head. Not a crown, not exactly, but close enough to make the statement unmistakable. Kael stood. The entire hall stood. Luna stood because not standing would mean admitting defeat publicly, and she was not there yet. Not yet. Kael walked to Celine and offered his arm. She took it. They walked together toward the high table, and the hall erupted in applause. Genuine, thunderous, the sound of people who wanted so desperately to believe in something hopeful that they would clap for a woman they did not know carrying a child they could not verify. Because hope, even false hope, tastes better than the empty plate reality has been serving them since the wars ended. Luna watched. She kept her face perfectly still. She clapped with everyone else, her palms meeting in a rhythm that matched the drums. And behind her eyes she counted the exits, catalogued the faces of every person clapping loudest, noted the council members who would not meet her gaze, and filed every piece of information in the cold, organized vault she had built inside herself during years of surviving things that should have killed her. Celine sat in the chair beside Kael, the chair that used to be Luna's. And when Celine turned and looked down the table at Luna and smiled that same warm, generous, devastating smile, Luna smiled back. And underneath the table, hidden from every eye in the hall, Luna's fingernails dug into her own thigh hard enough to draw blood. Because the pain was the only thing keeping her here, keeping her present, keeping her from standing up in front of the entire kingdom and screaming the truth that everyone in this room already knew but would never say. That the queen was being erased in real time, and the only person who could stop it was the person doing it, and he was not going to stop. The feast lasted 4 hours. Luna endured every minute. She ate food she could not taste. She smiled at people who could not look at her. She listened to Chancellor Aldrich give a speech about the glory of the Blackthorn bloodline and the sacred importance of alpha succession and the kingdom's joy at welcoming this blessed child, and she sat there with her spine straight and her hands folded and her heart hammering so hard she was certain the people on either side of her could hear it. When it was finally over, when the last toast had been raised and the last drum had sounded and the crowd had begun to drift toward the doors in clusters of whispered conversation, Luna stood from her chair and walked out of the great hall with the same measured, unhurried pace she had used to cross battlefields. She made it to the corridor. She made it past the tapestries with their silent, smiling queens. She made it to the stairwell that led to her chamber. Then her legs gave out. She caught herself against the wall and slid down until she was sitting on the cold stone floor with her back against the ancient bricks and her knees pulled up to her chest and her hands shaking so violently she could not clench them into fists. The torch above her sputtered and hissed. Shadows crawled across the walls. And in the silence of that empty stairwell, with no one watching, no one listening, no one caring where the queen had gone, Luna Morel pressed her face against her knees and let the first sob rip through her body like something tearing free from a cage. She did not cry softly. She did not cry like a lady or a queen or any of the things they had tried to make her. She cried the way a wounded animal cries, raw, ugly, shuddering sounds that came from somewhere beneath language, beneath dignity, beneath the 7 years of armor she had welded to her bones. She cried until there was nothing left, until her throat was raw and her eyes were swollen and the front of her black gown was wet with tears and snot and the remnants of every illusion she had been clinging to since the night those palace gates opened and her world walked in wearing white silk and a gold circlet. Then she stopped. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She pressed her palms against the cold floor and pushed herself upright. She stood in the empty stairwell and breathed, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way Marin had taught her during the war, when panic was a luxury and breath was the only weapon you always carried. She straightened her gown. She pushed her hair back from her face. She looked down the corridor toward the distant glow of the great hall, where the last guests were still drinking and laughing and celebrating the beginning of something they did not understand. Then she looked up the stairwell, toward the darkness of the upper floors, toward the south tower where Celine slept, toward the answers she had not yet found but could feel like a shape in the dark, close enough to touch if she could just figure out which direction to reach. 5 days. Vera's rider would return in 5 days. 5 days to keep smiling, 5 days to keep standing, 5 days to stay alive in a palace that was slowly, systematically, brick by brick, closing its walls around her. Luna started climbing, and as she climbed, she heard it, faint, almost imagined, carried on the cold draft that snaked down from the upper floors like a whispered warning. A sound that did not belong in the South Tower at this hour. A sound that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up and every survival instinct she possessed ignite like dry timber catching fire. A voice, male, low, speaking in a language that was not the common tongue of Blackthorn, coming from behind Celine's door. Luna froze on the staircase, one hand on the stone wall, one foot on the next step. Her breath held so tight in her lungs it burned. The voice stopped. A door opened somewhere above her. Footsteps crossed a landing, then silence. Luna stood in the darkness of that stairwell, her heart slamming against her ribs, her mind racing through every possibility like a wolf running through a burning forest. And she understood with a certainty that went deeper than thought, deeper than logic, all the way down to the animal core of her being. She was not the only one keeping secrets in this palace, and whatever secret was hiding behind that door was the kind that got people killed. Luna stood on that staircase for what felt like an hour, but was probably less than a minute. Her hand was still pressed against the cold stone wall. Her lungs were still burning from holding her breath. The voice she had heard behind Celine's door was gone now, swallowed by the silence the way a stone disappears into black water. No ripple, no trace, nothing to prove it had ever existed, except the memory vibrating in her skull like a struck bell. She exhaled, slowly, through her nose, the way you exhale when every instinct in your body is screaming at you to run. But your brain knows that running right now, in the dark, in a palace full of people who have already decided you are disposable, is the fastest way to confirm that you are a threat worth eliminating. She descended the staircase, one step at a time, her bare feet silent on the stone, her fingers trailing the wall for balance because her legs were still unsteady from the crying and the adrenaline and the simple biological fact that her body had been running on fury and insomnia for nearly 2 weeks and was starting to send her invoices she could not pay. She reached her chamber, closed the door, turned the iron lock. Then she crossed to the writing desk, pulled open the bottom drawer, and retrieved the leather journal she had kept since the first year of the war, the one filled with battle maps, supply calculations, intelligence notes, the careful documentation of a woman who had learned early that memory is unreliable, but ink on paper is a witness that does not change its story under pressure. She opened to a blank page. Her hand was still shaking, but her mind was not. She wrote 3 lines. Male voice, South Tower, language unknown. After midnight. She closed the journal, slid it back into the drawer, placed a stack of correspondence on top of it, bills from the quartermaster, invitations she would never answer, the administrative debris of a queen whose administrative life was being dismantled piece by piece. Then she sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about what kind of woman she needed to become in the next 5 days if she wanted to survive long enough to understand what was happening in this palace. The woman she had been, loyal, patient, willing to absorb punishment and call it devotion, that woman was a liability now. That woman had stood behind a man for 7 years and mistaken proximity for protection. That woman had confused being needed with being valued, and that woman was going to die in this palace if Luna did not kill her first. Not literally, but close enough. She lay back on the bed. The sheets were cold. The pillow smelled like lavender and loneliness. She closed her eyes and listened to her own heartbeat and made a decision that settled into her chest like a blade sliding into a sheath. No more waiting. No more smiling at people who were measuring her for a grave. Vera's rider was still days away, and every day she sat here being polite was another day the walls closed tighter. She would find out what was behind that door herself. She would find out who that voice belonged to, and she would do it not because she still believed this kingdom owed her something, but because the alternative was lying down and letting them bury her alive. And Luna Morelli had crawled through too much mud and blood and frozen hell to die quietly in a palace bedroom, while the woman replacing her slept 1 floor above in stolen silk. She fell asleep with her fists clenched. When she woke 3 hours later to the gray light of a winter dawn, her fingernails had left half-moon cuts in both palms, and the blood had dried to dark crescents that looked like tiny, angry smiles. Morning in the palace moved differently now. Luna noticed it the way you notice a current changing direction. Not all at once, but in 100 small adjustments that accumulate until you realize the river is flowing backward and you are the only one standing in its path. The servants who used to come to her chamber at first light, bringing hot water, fresh clothes, the day's schedule written on a folded card, stopped coming. Not officially. Nobody issued an order. They simply began arriving later, then sporadically, then not at all, redirected by some invisible gravitational pull toward the South Tower, where Celine was apparently requiring an expanding constellation of attendants for her expanding pregnancy. Luna dressed herself. She had been doing it for 3 days now, and was surprised to find she preferred it. There was something clarifying about the act. Lacing her own boots, fastening her own cloak, looking in the mirror and seeing a woman who owed nothing to the hands that had abandoned her. She chose dark gray today, practical. The kind of clothes you wear when you might need to move fast and do not want to be seen. She left her chamber and walked toward the council wing. The corridors were busy with morning traffic, advisors carrying scrolls, guards changing shifts, kitchen staff hauling trays toward the South Tower with the focused urgency of ants feeding a new queen in the hive. Luna moved through them like a ghost. People stepped aside for her, but not the way they used to. Not with the deferential nod that acknowledged rank. They stepped aside the way you step aside for something you do not want to touch. A stray dog. A bad omen. Something that used to matter but does not anymore. And nobody is sure how to behave around the transition. She found Vera in the small library off the council chamber. The young councilwoman was seated at a table covered in documents, her dark hair pulled back in a severe knot. A cup of cold tea at her elbow that she had clearly forgotten about hours ago. The bruise under her eye looked worse today, like it was spreading. Luna closed the door and sat down across from her. "I heard a voice last night," Luna said. No preamble, no greeting. There was no time left for the social choreography that polite women perform before they get to the point. Vera looked up. Her eyes sharpened the way a blade sharpens when you drag it across a stone. Fast, instinctive, the reflex of a mind that was built for trouble. Where? South Tower. Behind Celine's door, after midnight. Male. Speaking a language I did not recognize. Vera set down her pen. She leaned back in her chair and pressed her fingers together in front of her mouth, and Luna could see the calculations running behind her eyes. Fast, fluid, the machinery of a political mind processing data and discarding possibilities the way a card player discards low hands. "Could you identify the voice?" Vera said. "No, it was muffled, low. I was on the staircase, 1 floor below. Duration, seconds, maybe 10. Then a door opened and footsteps moved across the landing and everything went quiet. Vera was silent for a long moment. Then she reached into the stack of documents on the table and pulled out a folded piece of parchment. She unfolded it and slid it across to Luna. "This arrived this morning," she said, "from my contact in the Treasury." Luna read the document. It was a requisition order, authorized by Chancellor Aldrich, for a significant transfer of gold from the Blackthorn Royal Reserve to an account listed only as external diplomatic liaison. The amount was staggering, enough to fund a small army for 6 months. The authorization date was 3 days ago, the day before the feast. "External diplomatic liaison," Luna said. "Who?" "That is the question I have been sitting here asking myself for 2 hours, Vera said. "Blackthorn has no external diplomatic liaisons. We suspended all foreign accounts after the war. This is either a new arrangement that bypasses the full council, which is illegal, or someone is laundering money through the Treasury under a name that sounds official enough to avoid scrutiny." Luna stared at the document. The ink was fresh. The handwriting was Aldrich's. She recognized the cramped, precise lettering from years of reading council minutes. Aldrich, the old chancellor who had been Kael's most trusted advisor since before the war. The man who had given the speech last night about the glory of the Blackthorn bloodline, while Luna sat at the far end of the table and felt herself being erased word by word. "Aldrich is in this," Luna said. "Aldrich is in something," Vera corrected. "Whether it is this," she gestured vaguely toward the ceiling, toward the South Tower, toward the entire poisoned architecture of what was happening, "I do not know yet. But the money is real. The amount is real. And whoever is receiving it does not want their name on a piece of paper inside Blackthorn walls." Luna folded the document and slid it back across the table. Her mind was working now. Not the frantic scattershot thinking of the last 2 weeks, the desperate mental scramble of a woman trying to hold her life together with both hands while it crumbled between her fingers. This was different. This was the cold, systematic processing she used to do during the war. When the map was covered in enemy positions, and the only way through was to stop looking at the whole picture and start looking at the seams, the places where the pattern broke, the gaps. 2 gaps now, The voice behind Celine's door, the money flowing out of the treasury to a ghost account. Both appeared within days of the feast. Both were connected to the acceleration of Celine's position inside the palace. Coincidence was a word Luna had stopped believing in around the same time she stopped believing that loyalty earned loyalty. "I need to get into the South Tower," Luna said. Vera looked at her like she had just announced she intended to swim across a frozen river in her underclothes. "The South Tower is guarded," Vera said. Kyle assigned personal security to Celine after the feast. 2 men at the base of the staircase, one outside her door. "You cannot walk in there without being seen, reported, and—" Vera paused, choosing her words with the precision of someone diffusing a trap, "and given a reason to be removed from the palace entirely." Luna understood the implication. Removed, not exiled, not reassigned, removed. The way you remove a loose thread from a garment, quickly, cleanly, with no evidence it was ever part of the fabric. "There is a servant passage," Luna said, "from the kitchen cellars to the upper floors. It was built during the Second Wolf War for emergency evacuations. The entrance is behind the grain storage in the east cellar." Vera stared at her. "How do you know that?" "Because I studied every passage, every tunnel, every hidden door in this palace during the first year of the war. Because I did not trust that the walls would protect us, so I learned the walls. Every crack, every weakness, every way in and every way out." Something shifted in Vera's expression. Not surprise. Recognition. The look of a woman realizing that the person sitting across from her was not the broken, grieving queen. The rest of the palace believed they were watching crumble. Luna saw Vera recalculate, saw the numbers change behind her eyes. "When?" Vera said. "Tonight, after the midnight guard rotation. There is a 15-minute window when the interior patrols are thinnest." Vera picked up her cold tea, looked at it, set it down again. She ran her tongue over her teeth and exhaled through her nose, and said the only thing a woman in her position could say when the walls were closing and the legal channels were already compromised, and the only option left was the kind that gets you killed or vindicated with nothing in between. "I will create a distraction," she said. "Something in the West Wing. Noise complaint, maybe. Something that pulls at least one guard away from the tower staircase." Luna nodded. She stood. She looked down at Vera and felt something she had not felt in weeks. A connection to another human being that was not based on obligation or pity or the slow, suffocating performance of royal duty. It was based on something simpler and harder. The shared understanding that the truth was being buried alive in this palace, and they were the only two people willing to dig. "Be careful," Vera said. Luna did not answer that. She left the library and walked back through the corridors with her hands clasped behind her back and her face arranged in the blank, pleasant mask she had perfected over 7 years of standing beside a man who was slowly becoming a stranger. Servants passed her without acknowledgement. A council member she had known for years crossed to the other side of the hallway when he saw her coming. The palace was a living organism, and it had decided which cells to nourish and which to starve. And Luna could feel the starvation in every interaction, every averted gaze, every conversation that went silent when she entered a room. She spent the afternoon in her chamber, not pacing, not crying, planning. She laid out the route from the east cellar to the upper floors in her mind, tracing the servant passage step by step the way she used to trace supply lines through hostile territory. She identified 3 potential obstacles: a locked grate at the second-floor junction, a section of collapsed stone near the third-floor landing that she had reported to the maintenance steward 4 years ago and doubted anyone had repaired, and the final stretch to the South Tower corridor, which had no cover and required crossing an open hallway visible to anyone on the upper staircase. She changed into dark clothes, soft-soled boots, no jewelry. She braided her hair tight against her skull to keep it out of her face and wrapped a dark scarf around her neck that could double as a face covering if she needed it. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw a woman who looked less like a queen and more like the person she had been before the crown. A scout, a fighter, a wolf in human skin who moved through dangerous territory not because she was fearless, but because fear was just another form of energy, and she had learned a long time ago how to burn it for fuel. The hours crawled. Luna sat on the floor beside her bed with her back against the wall and her knees drawn up and her eyes closed, breathing in the slow, measured rhythm that kept her heartbeat low and her mind clear. She could hear the palace settling around her, the distant clank of the kitchen, the murmur of voices through stone walls, The occasional bark of a guard calling out a watch rotation. Normal sounds. The sounds of a kingdom that believed everything was fine, because the people in charge had told them it was fine. And most people prefer a comfortable lie to an uncomfortable question. Midnight came the way midnight always comes, not with a sound, but with a feeling, a thickening of the darkness, a deepening of the silence. The torch outside her door guttered low, and Luna opened her eyes and stood and felt her body shift into the state she knew from 100-night operations during the war. Every sense amplified, every muscle loose, every thought reduced to the immediate and the essential. She opened her door. The corridor was empty. She moved left, away from the main staircase toward the narrow service passage that connected the royal wing to the kitchens. Her footsteps were silent. The boots she had chosen were the same pair she had worn during the siege of the northern pass, broken in, flexible, the leather molded to her feet like a second skin. The kitchen was dark, embers glowing in the great hearth, the smell of bread dough rising overnight in covered baskets. She moved through the room without touching anything, navigating by memory and the faint orange light of the dying coals, and found the door to the east cellar behind a stack of flour barrels that had been rearranged since the last time she was here, but not enough to block the entrance. The cellar was black, absolute black, the kind of darkness that presses against your eyes like a physical thing and makes you understand why ancient people invented stories about monsters in the deep places of the world. Not because they believed in monsters, but because the darkness itself was monstrous enough. Luna did not light a torch. Light would travel. Light would be visible through cracks and under doors, and to anyone standing in the wrong hallway at the wrong moment. She moved by touch, one hand on the wall, counting her steps the way she had counted them 4 years ago when she first mapped this passage. 30 steps to the grain storage. Turn left. 12 steps to the iron grate. The grate was locked. She expected this. She had brought a thin steel pin, a piece of wire she had extracted from the binding of a ledger in her chamber, bent and shaped by feel until it was something that could work inside a simple iron lock. Not elegant, not fast, but functional. The way everything Luna did was functional, because elegance was a luxury for people who had time, and she had been out of time for 11 days. The lock yielded after 2 minutes of patient manipulation. The grate swung open on hinges that screamed in the silence like a wounded bird, and Luna froze, every muscle locked, waiting for the sound to travel and bring footsteps and torchlight and the end of everything. Nothing came. She waited 30 seconds, 60. Then she moved through the grate and pulled it closed behind her and continued upward through the passage. The collapsed section was worse than she remembered. Not impassable, but close. She had to press herself sideways through a gap between fallen stones, her chest compressed against the rock, her breath coming in short, forced bursts because there was not enough space to expand her lungs fully. Stones scraped her shoulders through her clothes. Dust filled her nose and mouth. For a terrible, suffocating moment, she got stuck, her hip catching on a jagged edge, and she had to exhale completely, emptying herself of air, making herself smaller, and then twist and push and feel the stone tear through her sleeve and into the skin of her upper arm before she broke free on the other side. She pressed her hand against the wound. Warm, wet, not deep, a flesh wound. The kind of thing she used to treat herself during the war without breaking stride, packing dirt into the cut and moving on because stopping meant dying, and pain was just information. Just her body telling her what was happening, and she already knew what was happening. She was climbing toward the truth, and the truth was going to cost her. The final stretch. She emerged from the passage into a narrow maintenance corridor on the 4th floor, just below the south tower. The air was different here, warmer, carrying the faint scent of jasmine and something else, something herbal and sharp, like medicine or poison. Through the thin wall to her left, she could hear the deep, rhythmic breathing of someone asleep. A guard, maybe, or a servant in a nearby chamber. She reached the junction where the maintenance corridor met the main hallway leading to Celine's door. She pressed herself against the wall and looked. One guard, standing outside the door. The other, the one who should have been at the base of the staircase, was gone. Vera's distraction had worked, partially. One down, one remaining. The remaining guard was a big man, broad-shouldered, standing with the bored posture of someone pulling a shift he resented. His torch cast a pool of yellow light around the door that left the rest of the hallway in deep shadow. Luna counted the distance. 15 feet of open hallway between her position and the dark alcove on the other side of Celine's door. 15 feet with no cover. If the guard turned his head at the wrong moment, he would see her. She watched the guard, studied his pattern. He shifted his weight from foot to foot every 30 seconds or so, and each time he shifted, his head dipped slightly to the left, toward the staircase. A habit, unconscious. Something he probably did without thinking, his body checking the most likely direction of approach and leaving the other direction, her direction, unwatched for 2, maybe 3 seconds. 3 seconds, 15 feet. In soft boots on stone floor with a bleeding arm and a heart rate that she was holding at 60 beats per minute through sheer force of will. She waited for the shift. It came. His weight moved left. His head dipped. She moved. 15 feet of absolute silence, her body low, her feet rolling heel to toe the way she had been taught by the scout commander during the first winter of the war. And then she was in the alcove, pressed into the shadow, her back against the cold stone, her chest heaving with suppressed breath that she would not release until the guard settled back into his stance. He settled. He did not turn. He had not seen her. Luna was 3 feet from Celine's door. She could hear voices on the other side, low, intense. 2 voices, and this time she was close enough to distinguish them. One was female, Celine's measured, honeyed tone, but stripped of its public sweetness, harder now, impatient, the voice of a woman talking to someone she did not need to impress. The other voice was male, the same voice from last night, and now this close, Luna could catch fragments of the language. Not the common tongue, not the northern dialects she had learned during the war, something older, harsher, consonants that hit like stones dropped into water. She pressed her ear against the cold wood of the door. Celine was speaking. English now, her voice low enough that Luna had to hold her breath and strain to hear. The ceremony is in 9 days. If the council formalizes the recognition before then, everything accelerates. Aldrich has the votes. Fenwick and Moreau are already committed. The only obstacle is the Morel woman, and Kael is handling that himself, whether he realizes it or not. A pause. The male voice responded, still in the other language. A few sentences, quick, clipped, the tone of someone delivering instructions rather than having a conversation. Then Celine again. I know the timeline. Tell him the gold arrived, 3 days ago, the full amount. Aldrich moved it through the treasury under the liaison cover, and no one questioned it because no one in that council has the spine to question anything right now. They are too busy celebrating. Another pause. Longer this time. Luna could hear movement inside the room. Footsteps, the creak of furniture, something being poured into a glass. The male voice spoke again, and this time, in the middle of the foreign syllables, Luna caught a word. Just one. But it hit her like a hammer to the chest, and she had to bite down on her own tongue to keep the sound from escaping. Valdris. The word was a name, and Luna knew that name. Every wolf in the Western Reach knew that name. Valdris Kane, the alpha of the Iron Fang clan, the man who had fought against Blackthorn during the war, the man whose forces had killed 2,000 wolves at the siege of the Red Valley before Kael's army broke through and drove them into the eastern wastes, the man who had sworn, in front of witnesses, as his clan retreated into exile, that Blackthorn would burn before the decade ended. Valdris Kane was supposed to be dead, or exiled, or broken beyond recovery in the frozen territories beyond the Grey Mountains. That was what the intelligence report said. That was what Kael believed. That was what everyone believed. But someone in that room had just spoken his name with the easy familiarity of someone discussing an active partner. Not a memory, not a ghost. A living, breathing, operational ally. Luna pulled her ear from the door. Her hands were shaking again, but this time not from grief or exhaustion. From the specific, razor-sharp tremor that comes when the shape of the thing you feared finally resolves into focus and turns out to be worse than anything you imagined. Celine's child was not Kael's. The gold was flowing to an enemy clan. The ceremony in 9 days was not a celebration. It was the final piece of an infiltration that had been running since before Celine walked through those gates, probably since before the war ended, probably since some night in some tent in some burned-out camp where a deal was struck between a woman with access and a man with a grudge, and someone decided that the fastest way to destroy Blackthorn was not from outside but from within, wrapped in white silk and carrying a child that everyone wanted so badly to believe in that they forgot to verify what it actually was. Luna had to move. Now. The guard would notice her eventually. The voices inside would stop, and someone might open that door. And if she was standing in this alcove 3 feet away with blood on her arm and fear in her eyes, she would not make it back down the staircase alive. She waited for the guard's shift. It came. She moved. Back through the hallway. Back into the maintenance corridor. Back down the passage, through the collapsed section, ripping her wound open again, fresh blood hot on her skin. Through the grate, down the cellar stairs, through the dark kitchen where the embers were dying and the bread was rising and the palace slept above her like a great stone animal that did not know it was infested with something eating it from the inside. She reached her chamber, locked the door, sat down at her writing desk and opened the journal and wrote everything. The voice, the language, the name, Valdris, the gold, the 9-day timeline, the ceremony. She wrote until her hand cramped and the cut on her arm had bled through her sleeve and stained the desk with a smear of dark red that looked like a signature. Then she sat back and stared at the words and understood with complete, devastating clarity the position she was in. She had the truth, or enough of it to see the shape, but the truth without proof was just accusation. An accusation from a queen who was already being marginalized would be dismissed as desperation, as jealousy, as the ravings of a woman who could not accept that she was being replaced and had invented a conspiracy to justify her refusal to go quietly. She needed Vera's rider. She needed evidence from Greyhallow. She needed something solid, documents, witnesses, a connection between Celine and Valdris Kane that could not be explained away by Aldrich's counsel or dismissed by a king who had already decided that the woman in the South Tower was carrying his legacy. 9 days. The ceremony was in 9 days. Vera's rider was still 4 or 5 days out. The math was brutal, but not impossible. If the rider returned with confirmation that Celine had not been in Greyhallow during the siege, that she had been somewhere else, with someone else, then Luna would have the first piece of physical evidence. Combined with the treasury document and what she had heard tonight, it might be enough to force Kael to order the full bloodline test, the one Marin had been told not to perform. But if the rider was late, if the roads were bad, if someone had already anticipated this and cut off the route, then the ceremony would happen, the recognition would be formalized, and the trap would close, and Luna would be standing inside it with nothing but a journal full of notes that nobody in power would ever read. She closed the journal. She hid it in the false bottom of her trunk, a compartment she had built herself during the war, because a woman who survives by information learns very quickly to build places where information cannot be found. Then she changed her clothes, washed the blood from her arm, wrapped the wound with a strip of linen torn from a bedsheet. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw a woman who had aged 10 years and 2 weeks, whose eyes were harder than they had any right to be, whose mouth was set in a line that was not anger or sadness, but something colder and more permanent. Resolution. The face of someone who has stopped negotiating with reality and started fighting it. The next 4 days were the worst of Luna's life, and she had lived through a war, so that was saying something. Kael summoned her to the throne room on the second morning, not privately, not quietly. He summoned her the way a king summons a subject, through a messenger with formal language, with a time and a place that left no room for negotiation. She went. She stood before the throne in the gray dress and the dark boots, and the face she had built for herself in the mirror, and she looked up at the man she had married and saw that the distance in his eyes had hardened into something official. There were 4 council members present: Aldrich, Fenwick, Moreau. Lord Graves, the oldest member, who sat in his chair like a man made of dry twigs and disapproval. Celine was not in the room, but her presence filled it the way smoke fills a room after someone blows out a candle. Invisible, pervasive, impossible to ignore. Kael spoke. His voice was level, practiced. The voice of a man reading from a script he had rehearsed. The council has determined that during the period of transition leading to the formal recognition of the heir, certain adjustments to palace authority are necessary to ensure stability and avoid conflicting directives. Luna listened. She kept her breathing even. She kept her hands at her sides, her fingers unclenched, her posture open, because everything about this moment was being watched and measured and recorded by the four men in this room, and she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. Effective immediately, Kael continued, your authority over palace staff, treasury access, and council scheduling is suspended. You retain the title of queen and all ceremonial privileges. Your chambers, personal guard, and household allowance remain unchanged. This is a temporary measure. It is not a punishment, Luna finished. Kael paused. It is not a punishment, he said. Luna looked at him. Really looked. The way she used to look at the battlefield before a charge, reading the terrain, measuring the angles, identifying the killing ground. What would you call it? She said. Necessary, said Chancellor Aldrich from his seat. His voice was thin and dry and carried the particular authority of a man who has spent decades weaponizing bureaucracy. The kingdom requires a clear chain of command during sensitive transitions. Multiple authorities create confusion. Confusion creates vulnerability. Surely you understand this, my queen. My queen. The title landed like a slap disguised as a handshake. Luna turned to face Aldrich. The old man met her gaze with the placid, immovable expression of a wall that has been standing long enough to believe it cannot fall. I understand perfectly, Chancellor, Luna said. I understand that you are stripping power from the woman who helped win the throne you currently sit beneath, to give it to a woman who arrived at this palace 2 weeks ago with a convenient pregnancy and a story that nobody has bothered to verify. The room went rigid. Fenwick shifted in his chair. Moreau's eyes dropped to the floor. Lord Graves made a sound in his throat that could have been a cough or a warning. Kael stood up. That is enough, he said. 3 words. Spoken with the flat, final authority of a man closing a door, he does not intend to open again. Not the voice of a husband, not even the voice of a king talking to his queen. The voice of a man talking to someone who has become inconvenient and needs to understand the new architecture of their insignificance. Luna held his gaze. She held it for 5 seconds. 10. Long enough for the silence to become its own kind of violence. Then she turned and walked out of the throne room. She did not slam the door. She closed it softly, because softness in a moment like this is louder than any scream, and she wanted every person in that room to hear the sound of a woman who was not breaking but transforming. She found Vera in the corridor outside. The young councilwoman had been waiting, her face tight, her hands clasped in front of her. How much did you hear? Luna said. Enough. Vera fell into step beside her. They walked quickly, voices low. The writer sent word. He is 2 days out. Maybe less. He found something, Luna. He did not say what. The message was coded, minimal. But he found something. Luna felt it then. Not hope. Something harder than hope. Certainty. The bone-deep, blood-level certainty of a woman who has been drowning and suddenly feels her foot touch solid ground. 2 days, she said. 2 days, Vera confirmed. They reached the junction where their paths diverged. Vera hesitated. Her face was doing something complicated. Fear and determination, and something that looked almost like admiration fighting for control of the same set of muscles. They are going to come for you, Vera said quietly. You know that. What you said in there, accusing Aldrich, questioning Celine, they cannot let that stand. You just painted a target on yourself. Luna looked at her, and in that look was every war she had survived, every wound she had healed, every night she had spent on frozen ground choosing to live when dying would have been easier. Good, Luna said. Let them come. Let them show themselves. Every predator that lunges reveals where its teeth are. She walked away. Behind her, the palace hummed with the low, constant vibration of power, rearranging itself around a new center of gravity, and Luna moved through it like a woman walking against a current that everyone else was swimming with, and she did not slow down, and she did not look back, because looking back was for people who believed the past would save them. And Luna had stopped believing in the past the night she heard a dead man's name spoken through a locked door. 2 days. In 2 days, the writer would return. In 2 days, she would have something real. Something that could not be dismissed or explained away or buried under the polite machinery of a council that had already been bought. But she would not get 2 days. The next morning, before the sun had cleared the eastern ridge, Commander Thorne arrived at her chamber door with 6 armed guards and a sealed document bearing the king's signet. Luna opened the door. She looked at Thorn. The old commander's face was gray. His eyes would not meet hers. His jaw was clenched so hard she could see the tendons in his neck standing out like ropes. "My queen," he said. His voice cracked on the word. "By order of the Alpha King, you are to vacate the royal palace within the hour. You are granted safe passage to the township of Breamore, where accommodations have been arranged. Your personal effects will be sent separately. This order is effective immediately and is not subject to council review." Luna took the document. She broke the seal. She read it, every word, slowly. The way you read something that is going to change your life, not because you think you can change it back, but because you want to remember exactly what the knife looked like before it went in. Exile. Dressed in the language of administrative relocation, but exile. Effective immediately. No hearing, no appeal, no chance to speak before the council, present evidence, or challenge the decision. A clean surgical removal of the only person in this palace who had questioned what was happening. Luna looked at Thorn, the commander who had fought beside her during the war, the man who had pulled her off a battlefield with 2 broken ribs and a collapsed lung and carried her to the medic tent on his own back. He was standing in her doorway now, holding the instrument of her erasure, and he could not look at her because looking at her would mean confronting the thing he was doing. And soldiers learn very early that the hardest battles are the ones where you have to look at the face of the person you are betraying. "When did he sign this?" Luna said. "Last night," Thorn said. His voice was almost inaudible. "Last night, while she slept, while she dreamed of evidence and riders and the truth arriving just in time. He had already decided. He had already signed the paper that would push her out of the walls she had helped build into the winter cold, alone, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a journal hidden in a trunk that would be searched and emptied before it ever reached her." The journal. Luna's blood went cold. "I need to gather my things," she said. 1 hour. Thorn hesitated, then nodded. 1 hour, my queen. I am sorry." She closed the door. She moved fast, not panicking, operating, the way she operated during the war when the position was overrun, and you had 60 seconds to grab what mattered and leave everything else to burn. She pulled the journal from the trunk's false bottom. She opened it, tore out the pages with her notes, folded them tight, and slid them into the lining of her boot, a compartment she had sewn there herself during the siege. Old habits. Survival habits. The habits of a woman who had always known, in some deep, unspoken part of herself, that the walls would close eventually and she would need to carry the truth on her body because there would be no one left to carry it for her. She left the rest. The clothes, the jewelry, the 7 years of accumulated life inside these walls. She put on her heaviest cloak, laced her boots tight, and stood in the center of the room that had been her world for 7 years and looked at it the way you look at a grave. Then she opened the door and walked out. Thorn and the guards escorted her through the palace, down the main corridor, past the tapestries, past the great hall, past the kitchens where the bread was baking and the staff went silent as she passed, through the courtyard where a single horse waited, saddled and packed with a thin bedroll and a saddlebag that probably contained enough provisions for 2 days, maybe 3 if she rationed. The palace gates were open. Beyond them, the city of Ashenmere stretched toward the horizon under a sky the color of iron. Snow was falling. Not gently, the kind of heavy, driving snow that comes sideways and stings your skin and turns the world into a white wall you cannot see through. Luna mounted the horse. She gathered the reins. She looked back at the palace one last time, at the stone walls and the iron gates and the south tower window where, if she squinted through the snow, she could just make out the shape of a woman standing behind the glass, watching. Celine. Standing there in her white gown with one hand resting on her belly and that smile on her face. Not warm anymore, not generous, stripped of every pretense. The real smile, the one underneath all the performance, and it was the coldest thing Luna had ever seen. Luna turned away. She urged the horse forward. The gates closed behind her with a sound like a coffin lid dropping, and the snow swallowed her, and the palace disappeared, and the road ahead was nothing but white emptiness stretching toward the northern territories where the winter killed everything it touched, and the only things that survived were the things too stubborn or too angry to die. And somewhere behind her, in a palace built on blood and lies, a clock was ticking toward a ceremony 9 days away that would seal the fate of a kingdom, and the only person who knew the truth was riding alone into a storm with torn pages in her boot and a wound on her arm that had started bleeding again, staining the snow behind her in a thin red trail that the wind erased almost as fast as it appeared. The storm hit full force 2 hours out of Ashenmere. Luna had been riding north on the Braymore Road, following the frozen ruts left by merchant carts that had passed before the weather turned, when the wind shifted direction without warning and the snow went from heavy to blinding in the space of 3 breaths. One moment she could see the tree line 50 yards ahead. The next moment the world was white. Not the clean white of fresh snowfall, but the violent, disorienting white of a blizzard that erases every landmark and every horizon and leaves you moving through a void where direction is a guess and survival is a negotiation between your body and the cold always wins eventually. The horse fought it for the first mile. A gray mare, sturdy, mountain-bred, the kind of animal that had been raised on hard weather and bad footing. But even mountain horses have limits, and the mare found hers when a gust of wind hit them broadside hard enough to make the animal stagger. Luna felt the mare's legs buckle, felt the massive body lurch sideways, and she threw her weight in the opposite direction to keep them both upright, and felt something in her shoulder pop, not a dislocation, but close, the tendons stretching past their tolerance and sending a bolt of white pain down her arm that made her vision swim. She dismounted. Leading was safer than riding in conditions this bad. She pulled the mare's head close to her body, and they walked together into the wind, Luna's free hand shielding her eyes, her boots punching through the snow crust with each step, the cold working its way through her cloak and her clothes and her skin, and settling into her muscles like something that intended to stay. She had been cold before. During the siege, during the march to Grey Hallow, during the night she spent in a collapsed trench with 2 dead soldiers and a broken arm, waiting for dawn and counting her heartbeats, because counting gave her something to do besides think about how easy it would be to close her eyes and let the cold take her. She knew cold. She knew its stages. She knew how it started with discomfort and progressed to pain and then to numbness and then to a strange, treacherous warmth that was the most dangerous stage of all because it meant your body had stopped fighting and started surrendering, and the surrender felt like relief, and relief felt like sleep. And sleep in a blizzard was a door that only opened one way. She was somewhere between pain and numbness when the trees appeared. Not the thin, sparse pines of the lower foothills, but the dense, ancient growth of the northern forests. Massive trunks, branches heavy with snow, a canopy so thick that the wind dropped from a scream to a moan the moment she stepped beneath it. The mare snorted and pressed forward, instinct driving it toward shelter, the way instinct drives every living thing toward the thing it needs most when the alternative is dying in the open. Luna found a depression between 2 fallen trunks. Not a cave. Not shelter in any real sense. But the logs broke the wind and the snow was shallower here, and she could press her back against the wood and pull the mare close and use the animal's body heat to slow the cold that was working its way toward her core. She sat in the dark. Snow drifted down through gaps in the canopy. Her shoulder throbbed. The cut on her arm had opened again. She could feel the warm trickle under her sleeve, and she pressed her hand against it and applied pressure and thought about Marin, who had taught her wound care during the war, and Marin's trembling hands, and Marin's fear, and the words the old healer had spoken in that basement study. Be very careful about who you trust. She had been careful. She had been strategic. She had gathered evidence and built alliances and mapped the conspiracy with the same precision she had used to map enemy positions during the war. And none of it had mattered. Kael had moved faster, or Aldrich had, or Celine. Someone had seen her coming and closed the gate before she could get through, and now she was sitting in a snowbank in the northern forests, with torn pages in her boot and a bleeding arm and no allies and no authority, and the creeping acid understanding that being right about the conspiracy was worthless if she was dead in a ditch before anyone heard her say it. The mare shifted, restless. Her ears were up, rotating, tracking something Luna could not hear. An animal sound, distant, muffled by the storm. Could be wolves, real wolves, the wild kind, not the shapeshifters who ruled kingdoms and betrayed their mates. Real wolves were honest. They killed because they were hungry. They did not dress it up in ceremony and call it politics. Luna almost laughed. Almost. She caught it in her throat because laughing alone in a blizzard felt too much like the first step towards something she could not come back from. She closed her eyes. Not to sleep. to think, to strip everything away, the anger, the grief, the bone-deep exhaustion, and look at her situation the way a commander looks at a map after the battle plan has collapsed and every fallback position has been overrun. What did she have? Torn pages with notes that proved nothing without corroboration. Knowledge of a conspiracy that was useless without a platform to present it. A body that was running out of warmth, and a horse that was running out of patience, and a road to Braemore that might as well lead to a prison cell because exile was just imprisonment with better scenery. What did she not have? Allies, resources, time. The writer Vera had sent was still days from returning, and even if he returned with proof, Vera had no way to reach Luna and Braemore without drawing exactly the kind of attention that would get them both killed. What could she do? Keep moving, reach Braemore, find shelter, regroup. Send word to Vera through channels that Aldrich's network could not intercept. Wait for the writer's evidence, build a case. It was a plan, not a good one. The kind of plan you make when every good option has been eliminated and you are choosing between bad and worse, and the only thing that makes bad the right choice is that worse means giving up. And giving up was not something Luna's body knew how to do. She opened her eyes. The storm was easing, not stopping. Storms like this did not stop. They just paused to catch their breath before coming back harder. But the wind had dropped enough that she could see the tree line again, and through the trees, the faint gray suggestion of the road continuing north. She stood. Her legs protested. Her shoulder screamed. She gathered the mare's reins and started walking. She made it another mile before the arrows started. The first one hit the tree trunk 6 inches from her head. A dull, meaty thunk that was nothing like the sharp crack of an arrow hitting stone and everything like the sound of something designed to kill, embedding itself in wood instead of flesh, because the shooter had missed by half a foot in bad visibility and would not miss again. Luna dropped. Instinct. Muscle memory from the war taking over before conscious thought could catch up. She hit the snow and rolled behind the nearest tree, pulling the mare with her, and the second arrow passed through the space where her chest had been a half-second earlier and disappeared into the snowfall behind her. The mare screamed. Not hit, terrified. The sound of a large animal that understands it is in danger and wants to run, but is being held by a human who is crouched behind a tree, calculating angles and distances the way she calculated them during every ambush she survived in 7 years of war. 2 arrows, both from the east, both high angle, meaning elevated position, hillside or ridge. The grouping was tight, 6 inches apart on a moving target in a blizzard. Professional, not bandits, not opportunists. Trained shooters who had been positioned ahead of her on the road, which meant they knew her route, which meant someone had told them where she would be. A third arrow hit the snow 2 feet to her left, closer. They were adjusting. Luna moved. She abandoned the road and drove into the thick forest, pulling the mare behind her, ducking under branches, weaving between trunks, putting as much dense wood between herself and the eastern ridgeline as possible. Arrows snapped through branches above her. One grazed the mare's flank, a shallow cut that drew blood and made the animal lunge forward so hard it nearly pulled the reins from Luna's frozen hands. She ran. Through the trees, through snow that was knee-deep in places and waist-deep in others, through branches that whipped her face and tore at her cloak and left thin red lines across her cheeks that she did not feel because the adrenaline had eaten the pain the way fire eats paper. Fast, total, leaving nothing behind but heat and the bright, savage clarity of a body that has decided to live and is rerouting every available resource toward that single objective. Behind her, she could hear them. Not arrows now. Footsteps. Fast. Multiple sets. Crashing through the undergrowth with the confident, unhurried pace of hunters who know the terrain and know their prey is wounded and cold and running out of forest. 4 of them. Maybe 5. She could not see them through the snow and the trees, but she could hear the pattern. Spread formation, flanking left and right, trying to drive her toward a choke point. She had seen this tactic before. She had used this tactic before, during the war, when they were hunting enemy scouts in the Ashfall Forest, and the trick was to push the target toward a ravine or a clearing where there was no cover and the kill shot was clean. She was the scout now. She was the prey. The forest thinned ahead of her. She could see it. A break in the trees, A wide clearing covered in unbroken snow, and beyond it a ridge that dropped away into a river gorge. A dead end. A killing ground. The exact kind of terrain they were driving her toward. She pulled the mare to a stop. The animal was blowing hard, steam pouring from its nostrils, blood running from the cut on its flank. Luna pressed her forehead against the mare's neck and breathed and thought, and heard the hunters getting closer, and made a decision that would have sounded insane to anyone who had not spent 7 years learning that the worst position in any fight is the position your enemy chose for you. She released the mare, slapped its hindquarters hard. The animal bolted forward into the clearing, running straight for the ridge, a large gray shape moving fast through the white void. A decoy. The hunters would see movement, would track the largest target, would spend precious seconds realizing it was riderless. Luna went left, not forward. Left. Into the densest part of the remaining tree line, moving low, moving quiet, circling back the way she had come. Back toward the hunters. Toward the last direction they would expect a fleeing target to move. She heard the shouts behind her, 2 voices, harsh, clipped commands in a language she recognized now. The same language she had heard through Celine's door. Iron Fang dialect, Valdris Kane's people, the dead man's army, very much alive and very much here in the northern forests, with arrows and formation tactics and orders to make sure the exiled queen did not survive long enough to reach Bray Moor. She pressed herself against a massive pine trunk, her back against the bark, her breathing controlled, in through the nose, out through the mouth, shallow, silent. The cold had stopped mattering. The pain had stopped mattering. Everything had narrowed to a single point of focus. The footsteps in the snow getting closer. 2 sets now, the others having split off to chase the mare. Closer, closer. She saw the first one. A man. Tall, lean, dressed in dark furs, carrying a short bow with an arrow already nocked. Moving carefully through the trees, scanning the ground for tracks. He was 10 feet away, then 8, then 5. He passed the tree she was hiding behind. His back to her, his attention forward, on the clearing where the mare had disappeared. Luna stepped out behind him. She had no weapon. She had her hands and her body, and 7 years of combat training that she had never fully abandoned despite the gowns and the ceremonies and the slow, suffocating performance of queenship. She locked her arm around his throat from behind, drove her knee into the back of his leg to buckle it, and twisted hard, using her body weight to drag him down. The bow clattered into the snow. The man choked, grabbed at her arm, thrashed. She held on, not trying to kill him, trying to silence him, trying to buy seconds. He was stronger, bigger. He broke her grip and spun and hit her across the face with the back of his hand. A blow that snapped her head sideways and filled her vision with bright, spinning light. She tasted blood, copper, and salt. She hit the snow on her back, and he was on top of her, one hand around her throat, the other pulling a knife from his belt, and she looked up at his face, scarred, hard, the eyes flat and professional, the expression of a man doing a job he had done many times before. And she thought, with a clarity that was almost peaceful, this is where it ends, not with ceremony, not with a speech. In the snow, in the dark, with a stranger's hand on her throat, and the taste of her own blood in her mouth, and the storm howling above the trees like something mourning. Then the man's head jerked sideways. A sound. Wet, sharp, final. He slumped forward onto her, heavy and suddenly boneless, and Luna shoved him off and scrambled backward through the snow and saw the arrow buried in his temple, fletched with black feathers she did not recognize. A shape moved through the trees, then another, then 5 more. Dark shapes, moving fast, silent, appearing out of the blizzard like they were made of it. They wore black, not the military black of palace guards or the practical dark of hunters, but something else, something that looked like the forest itself had grown armor and learned to walk. The remaining assassins did not last long. Luna heard the sounds, brief, violent, efficient, a scream cut short, the thud of bodies hitting snow, then silence, broken only by the wind and her own ragged breathing and the approaching footsteps of someone walking toward her with a pace that was neither hurried nor cautious, the pace of a man who owned the ground he walked on and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. He stopped in front of her, looked down. She was still on the ground, propped on her elbows, blood on her face, snow melting in her hair, one hand pressed against her bruised throat. She looked up at him and saw a man who was everything Kyle was not. Broader, darker, wearing his scars like credentials instead of inconveniences. A face that had been broken and rebuilt more than once, with eyes the color of iron in winter and a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile years ago and had never missed the ability. He extended a hand. Luna stared at the scarred knuckles, at the calluses, at the thin line of someone else's blood running down his wrist from a blade she had not seen him use but could picture clearly. She did not take the hand. She stood on her own, slowly, painfully. Her legs were shaking, her throat burned. The cut on her arm was bleeding again, and the right side of her face was swelling where the assassin had hit her. And every part of her body was sending urgent messages to her brain that all said the same thing. Sit down, stop, rest. You are done. She did not sit down. Who are you? She said. Her voice came out wrecked, raw. The voice of a woman who had been strangled and punched and frozen and hunted through a forest and was still standing because standing was the only verb her body knew how to conjugate. The man studied her for a long moment, not with the calculating assessment of a political mind or the clinical evaluation of a healer, with something else. Something that looked almost like recognition, like he was seeing something he had expected to find but was still surprised to see in person. Riker Vale, he said. His voice was low, rough. The kind of voice that sounded like gravel and tasted like smoke. And you are Luna Morell, the woman Blackthorn just threw into a blizzard with a death squad on her trail and not even a knife to fight back with. Luna wiped the blood from her lip with the back of her hand. She looked at the dead assassin in the snow. She looked at the dark figures standing motionless among the trees, weapons still drawn, watching her with the patient, predatory stillness of wolves waiting for their alpha to give a command. Shadowfang, she said. Riker inclined his head. A confirmation, not a bow. The distinction mattered, and they both knew it. Luna had heard the stories. Everyone had heard the stories. Riker Vale, the Alpha who ruled the Northern Territories. The man who had refused to fight in the Western Reach Wars, not because he was a coward, but because he had looked at the conflict and seen what it actually was beneath the rhetoric of honor and bloodlines and sacred duty. A power grab by alphas who cared more about thrones than the people dying to win them. He had pulled his clan into the mountains and sealed the passes, and told both sides that any army that crossed into Shadowfang territory would not cross back, and both sides had believed him because Riker Vale was not the kind of man who made threats. He made promises, and his promises had teeth. The kingdom called him a traitor. The council called him dangerous. Kyle called him a coward who hid in the mountains while real alphas fought for the future. Luna had never had an opinion. She had been too busy surviving to form one. But she was forming one now, standing in the snow with a dead assassin at her feet and the taste of her own blood in her mouth, looking at the man who had just saved her life when the man she married had signed the order that was supposed to end it. You were watching the road, she said. It was not a question. Riker nodded. We have been tracking Iron Fang movement in the northern corridor for 3 weeks. Small groups, scouts, supply caches hidden in the forest. Someone is building an operational network in territory that borders mine, and I take that personally. And you just happened to be here when they tried to kill me. Something moved in Riker's expression. Not a smile, the shadow of one, the ghost of amusement in a face that had been built for harder things. Nothing happens in these forests without me knowing, he said. You rode out of Ashenmere this morning, alone, in a blizzard, with no escort and no weapons. That is either the bravest thing I have seen in years or the stupidest. I had not decided which when the arrows started. Luna felt something unfamiliar rise in her chest. Not warmth, not gratitude. Something more angular than that. The sharp, uncomfortable recognition of being seen clearly by someone who had no reason to soften the picture. She looked at the dead man again, then at the forest, then back at Riker. They were Iron Fang, she said. Riker's expression hardened. Not surprise, confirmation of something he already suspected. Iron Fang has been officially dissolved since the war, he said. Their alpha is in exile. Their territory was absorbed by Blackthorn. There should be no Iron Fang fighters operating anywhere, least of all in organized kill teams with professional-grade weapons and advanced knowledge of a target's route. Luna reached into her boot. Her fingers were stiff from the cold, but they found the folded pages. Damp, blood-stained, but legible. She pulled them out and held them in front of her and watched Riker's eyes drop to the papers and then rise back to her face with a new intensity, a sharpened focus, the look of a man who has just realized that the woman standing in front of him is not a refugee, but a source. Valdris Kane is not in exile, Luna said. He is running an operation inside Blackthorn. His people are inside the palace. His money is flowing through the royal treasury. And the woman carrying the child that the entire kingdom believes is the alpha heir is not carrying Kael's child. She is carrying Valdris Kane's. The words hung in the frozen air between them. Riker did not move. His fighters did not move. The forest did not move. For a long suspended moment, the only things that existed were Luna's voice and the truth she had just spoken aloud for the first time. And the truth felt like a blade leaving a wound, painful, bloody, but clean. Riker took the pages. He read them. His eyes moved down the cramped handwriting. Luna's notes from the journal, the fragments of overheard conversation, the treasury figures, the name Valdris spoken through a locked door. And his face did something Luna had not expected. It went still, completely still. The kind of stillness that only happens when a very dangerous man is processing information that changes everything and is deciding in the space between one breath and the next what kind of violence the new reality requires. He looked up. How long, he said. Luna understood the question. Not how long had Celine been in the palace. How long had the operation been running? How deep were the roots? I do not know, she said. Months. Maybe longer. Since before she arrived. The timing of her reappearance, the pregnancy, the council votes, it was choreographed. All of it. Someone has been building this from the inside for a long time, and by the time any of us saw it, the structure was already in place. Riker folded the pages. He slid them into his coat. Then he turned and gave a short, sharp whistle, and his fighters moved. Fast, silent, the kind of coordinated movement that comes from years of training together in conditions that would kill anyone who hesitated. Two of them retrieved the dead assassin's weapons. A third found Luna's mare. The animal had stopped at the ridge edge, too smart to jump, and brought it back. A fourth was already scouting the perimeter, checking for additional threats with the focused efficiency of a man who expected the worst and built his entire life around being ready for it. Riker turned back to Luna. He looked at her face, the swelling, the blood, the bruised throat, the eyes that were still sharp despite everything, still calculating, still alive with the particular intensity of a woman who had been beaten and frozen and nearly killed and was still standing because she had decided to stand. And that decision was the only thing left that belonged entirely to her. You have two choices, Riker said. Keep riding to Braymore, where you will sit in a provincial house with no resources and no protection while Valdris Kane's people finish what they started tonight. Or come with me. Luna looked north. The storm was building again. She could feel it in the pressure change, the way the wind was gathering itself for another assault. The dropping temperature that was already turning the wet blood on her face to a thin, cracking glaze. She thought about Braymore, a small town, a house selected by the same council that had stripped her authority and signed her exile. A town that Aldrich's network could reach easily. A place where a woman alone with no allies and no weapons and no authority would be easy to find and easier to eliminate. And the official story would be simple. The exiled queen succumbed to the winter, a tragedy. The kingdom mourns. She thought about Kael, the man she had married, the man who had signed the order that put her on this road. Did he know about the assassins? Did he order them? Or was he so deep inside the machinery of Celine's operation that he did not even understand what he had set in motion when he pushed Luna out the gate and into the storm? It did not matter. That was the thing she understood now, standing in the snow with a dead man at her feet and the taste of blood in her mouth and the cold eating into her bones. It did not matter whether Kael knew. It did not matter whether he was complicit or manipulated or simply too blinded by the promise of an heir to see the knife aimed at his own back. What mattered was that she was here, alone, nearly dead. And the man she had given 7 years to had either tried to kill her or created the conditions that allowed someone else to try. And the difference between those two things was a distinction that might matter in a philosophy lecture, but meant nothing in a frozen forest with arrows in the trees. She had spent 7 years building her identity around one man. His war, his crown, his kingdom, his promise that she would stand beside him forever, and forever turned out to mean until someone more useful came along. She had poured herself into the vessel of that promise until there was nothing left of her that existed independently. And when the vessel broke, she nearly broke with it. Nearly, but not completely. Because underneath the queen, underneath the wife, underneath the woman who smiled at feasts and held her tongue in council meetings and told herself that patience was the same as strength, there was something older, something that had existed before Kael, before the war, before the crown, the thing that had kept her alive during the siege, the thing that had driven her to map every passage in the palace, the thing that was standing in this forest right now, bleeding and frozen and furious, refusing to die. Luna looked at Riker Vale. She looked at the Shadowfang fighters standing in the trees like dark pillars, waiting, patient, the kind of soldiers who followed a leader not because of a title, but because of what that leader had proven with blood and time, and the kind of trust that cannot be faked. She looked at her own hands, shaking, bloodied, calloused from 7 years of a war she won for someone else. Then she stopped shaking. She closed her hands into fists and felt the half-moon cuts from last night press into her palms. Tiny points of pain that were her own, entirely her own, not given to her by anyone and not owed to anyone. "Take me to your camp," she said. Riker did not smile, did not nod. He turned and started walking north into the deep forest, into the territory that every map in Blackthorn marked with warnings. And Luna fell into step behind him, and the Shadowfang fighters closed around her like a dark current, and the storm swallowed the road behind them, burying the dead and the blood and the last physical evidence that Luna Morell, former Queen of Blackthorn, had ever been on that road at all. She did not look back. Not once. Not at the road. Not at the direction of Ashenmere. Not at the 7 years she was leaving behind in the snow. She walked forward, into the unknown, into the territory of a man she did not know and an army she did not command, and a future she could not predict. And with every step she felt something falling away from her. Not hope, not strength, but the last remnants of the woman who had believed that loyalty was enough, that sacrifice was enough, that being good and faithful and patient would eventually be rewarded by a world that measured value in bloodlines and power and the willingness to destroy anyone who stood between a king and the thing he wanted most. That woman was dead. She had died somewhere on the road between Ashenmere and this forest, between the palace gates closing behind her and the arrow that missed her skull by 6 inches, between the hand on her throat and the decision to stand up when standing up was the hardest thing her body had ever done. The woman walking north was someone else, someone who did not yet have a name or a shape or a plan, but who had the only thing that matters when everything else has been stripped away, the absolute marrow-deep refusal to be erased. The Shadowfang camp materialized out of the forest like something that had always been there and had simply chosen this moment to let itself be seen. It was nothing like Blackthorn. No stone walls, no iron gates, no tapestries glorifying dead men. The camp was built into the forest itself. Structures of dark timber and stretched hide nestled between the massive trunks, connected by paths that followed the natural contours of the terrain instead of imposing straight lines on it. Smoke rose from a dozen fire pits, thin and controlled, designed to disperse before it cleared the canopy. Fighters moved between the structures with the quiet, purposeful energy of people who had work to do and no interest in performing it for an audience. Riker led her to a structure near the center of the camp, larger than the others. A command post, Luna recognized. The layout, the positioning, the way the paths converged on it like veins leading to a heart. Inside, a fire burned in a stone pit, and the warmth hit her like a wall. Her knees buckled. She caught herself on the doorframe and forced her legs to hold, and walked to the fire and stood there with her hands extended, watching the ice on her cloak begin to melt and drip onto the stone floor. Riker sent for a healer. A woman appeared, mid-40s, compact, with the efficient hands of someone who had treated wounds in field conditions and did not believe in wasting time on gentleness when speed was the difference between a living patient and a dead one. She cleaned the cut on Luna's arm, reset the strained tendons in her shoulder, packed the wound with a poultice that burned like a brand, and wrapped everything in clean linen without saying a single unnecessary word. Luna sat by the fire and let the warmth work its way into her body and felt, for the first time in weeks, the specific relief of being in a place where nobody was trying to erase her. Not safe, She was not naive enough to call this safety. Riker had his own calculations, his own agenda. He had saved her because she had information he needed, and information was a currency that spent differently depending on who was holding it. But at least the transaction was honest. At least the man sitting across the fire from her was not pretending that the knife he carried was a gift. Riker poured 2 cups of something dark and hot from an iron pot. He handed one to Luna. She drank it. Bitter. Earthy. The kind of drink that tasted like survival instead of pleasure. "Tell me everything," Riker said. So she did. From the beginning. Celine's arrival, the pregnancy, the suppressed blood test, the voice behind the door, the treasury document, Aldrich's involvement, the language she had heard, Iron Fang dialect, the name Valdris, the exile, the assassins. She laid it out the way she used to lay out intelligence briefings during the war. Facts first, connections second, gaps third. And Riker listened without interrupting, his eyes on the fire, his face unreadable, the cup in his hand untouched. When she finished, the fire had burned low, and the silence between them was the kind of silence that happens when 2 people are looking at the same map and seeing the same catastrophe. 9 days, Riker said. The ceremony. Luna nodded. 6 now. Maybe 5. I lost count on the road. The ceremony formalizes the heir. Once the council recognizes the child publicly, Celine's position inside the palace becomes permanent. And if the child carries Valdris Kane's blood instead of Kael's, then Valdris has a legitimate claim to the Blackthorn throne through his own offspring, Luna finished. Not through invasion, through bloodline. The one thing the Blackthorn Council values above everything else. They would have handed him the kingdom wrapped in ceremony and sealed with their own votes. And by the time anyone realized what happened, the transfer of power would already be legal. Riker set down his cup. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and stared into the fire with the expression of a man watching a building burn and calculating whether anything inside is worth saving. Kael does not know, Riker said. It was not a question. Luna was quiet for a long moment. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moved through the camp like a living thing, pressing against the walls, testing the seams. I do not know what Kael knows, she said finally. I do not know if he is blind or complicit or simply too proud to consider the possibility that a woman could outmaneuver him in his own palace. What I know is that he signed my exile. He stripped my authority. He put me on a road where assassins were waiting. And whether he did those things because he is part of the conspiracy or because the conspiracy used his weakness against him, the result is the same. I was supposed to die in that storm. The truth was supposed to die with me. She looked at Riker across the fire. The light carved his face into planes of shadow and gold, and she could see in his expression something she had not seen in any face inside Blackthorn for a very long time. Not pity, not calculation, respect. The specific, hard-won respect of one survivor recognizing another. It did not die, Riker said. No, Luna said. It did not. The fire popped. Embers rose into the dark air like tiny, furious stars, burning bright for a moment before the cold extinguished them. And somewhere south, behind walls of stone and political machinery and lies stacked so high they looked like tradition, a kingdom was 5 days away from handing itself to the man who had sworn to destroy it. And the only people who knew the truth were sitting in a camp that officially did not exist, in a territory that every map marked as hostile, drinking bitter tea and staring into a fire and understanding with absolute, devastating clarity that stopping what was coming would require something more than evidence and strategy, and the righteous fury of a woman who had been wronged. It would require Luna to become something she had never been before. Not a queen, not a wife, not the loyal shadow standing behind someone else's throne. Something harder. Something that the woman who walked out of Ashenmere this morning would not recognize. Something with teeth. 5 days burned like wet powder. Slow at the edges, then all at once. Luna spent the first 2 in Riker's war room, hunched over maps she had drawn from memory with charcoal on stretched hide, laying out the interior of Blackthorn Palace with the obsessive precision of a woman who had memorized every corridor, every staircase, every blind spot in 7 years of living inside those walls. The passages, the guard rotations, the council chamber entrances, the throne room sight lines, the South Tower access points. Every piece of architecture that had once been her prison was now her ammunition, and she spread it across the table the way a general spreads a battle plan, because that is what this was now. A battle. And the only advantage she had over the enemy was that she knew the ground better than anyone alive. Riker watched. He did not interrupt. He stood on the other side of the table with his arms crossed and his iron-colored eyes tracking every line she drew, and when she finished, he studied the maps in silence for a long time before speaking. "The ceremony," he said. "Where exactly?" "The Great Hall." "Main floor." The throne is positioned on the northern wall, elevated platform, 3 steps. The council seats are arranged in a semicircle facing the throne. Public gallery runs along the east and west walls, upper level, accessible by the twin staircases at the south entrance. Capacity is roughly 400. On ceremony days, the palace guard doubles. Perimeter teams on the walls, interior teams at every entrance, personal security flanking the throne. And Celine, she will be positioned beside Kael on the platform. The announcement requires the king to present the heir-bearing mother to the council and the public gallery simultaneously. That means she will be standing, visible, center stage, for the duration of the formal declaration. 15 minutes minimum. Riker traced a line on the map with his finger. The south entrance. Wide. 2 doors. The main public access point. Luna nodded. Also the weakest point. The twin staircases create a bottleneck. If both doors are held, nobody enters or exits the hall without passing through a 12-foot corridor with no cover. During the war, I recommended reinforcing that corridor with a secondary gate. The council rejected it. Too expensive. Something shifted in Riker's expression. Not a smile. His face did not seem built for those, but a flicker of something dark and appreciative. The look of a man who has spent his life studying fortifications and just found a kindred mind in the last person he expected. "You think like a siege commander," he said. "I was a siege commander," Luna said, "for 9 days on a frozen mountain. The fact that nobody gave me the title does not change what I did." Riker held her gaze for a beat longer than necessary. Then he turned back to the map. They spent the next 3 days building a plan that was part surgical strike, part political theater, and part the kind of desperate gamble that only works when the people executing it have nothing left to lose and therefore nothing left to fear. And Luna understood with every passing hour that this distinction between a person with something to protect and a person with nothing left but the fight itself was not just tactical. It was the difference between hesitation and commitment. A person defending their position will pause, will calculate risk, will weigh what they might lose. A person who has already lost everything moves differently, faster, harder. With the terrifying efficiency of someone who has passed through the worst thing they can imagine and discovered that the other side is not despair, but a kind of savage, crystalline freedom that makes you more dangerous than you have ever been in your life. Luna felt that freedom now. It sat in her chest like a second heartbeat. Cold, steady. The rhythm of a woman who had been stripped of her crown, her home, her name, her husband, and her place in the world and had found, at the bottom of all that loss, something that none of those things had ever given her. The knowledge that she could survive without any of them. On the morning of the 4th day, Vera's rider arrived. He came in half dead. Frostbitten. His horse collapsed at the edge of the Shadowfang perimeter, and 2 scouts carried him the last half-mile into camp. He was a young man, early 20s, with the lean, weathered look of someone who had been riding hard for a week through conditions that should have killed him twice. His lips were cracked and bleeding. His fingers were black at the tips. He could barely speak, but he had the documents. Luna knelt beside the cot where the healers had laid him and took the oilskin packet from inside his coat with hands that were steady because she had decided they would be steady, because this moment was too important for trembling. And she opened the packet and spread the contents on the cot and read them while the young man drifted in and out of consciousness, and the fire crackled and the camp went about its business outside with the disciplined normalcy of people who understood that their Alpha's war room was not their concern. 3 documents. The first was a statement from a merchant in Greyhallow who swore, under Vera's seal, that no woman matching Celine Voss's description had been present in the town during the siege. The merchant had been there the entire time, had kept detailed records of every person who passed through his trading post during the conflict, had a memory for faces that bordered on obsessive. Celine Voss was not among them. The second document was a field report from a scout Vera had stationed at the eastern border. a report that had been filed 6 months ago and buried in the archive by someone with enough access to make inconvenient intelligence disappear. The report described a small, well-supplied party crossing into Blackthorn territory from the eastern wastes. A woman, 4 armed escorts, supplies and provisions consistent with a long journey from deep inside Iron Fang territory. The woman was described as dark-haired, late 20s, visibly pregnant. The date of the crossing was 8 months ago. The exact time Celine Voss had reportedly risen from the dead and begun her journey to the palace gates. The third document was the one that made Luna's hands finally shake. It was a letter, handwritten, addressed to Chancellor Aldrich. The handwriting was not Celine's. Luna had seen Celine's writing on the formal document she had signed inside the palace, and this was different, harder, more angular, the handwriting of a man accustomed to giving orders on paper. The letter was brief. It discussed the timeline, the pregnancy, the ceremony, the gold transfers, and it was signed with a single name that confirmed everything Luna had suspected and feared and heard through a locked door in the dark of a South Tower stairwell. Valdris Kane. Luna held the letter. She read it 3 times. Each reading drove the truth deeper into her understanding like a nail being hammered into wood, each strike more final than the last. Each stroke eliminating another possibility that it was a mistake, a misunderstanding, a conspiracy theory invented by a desperate woman who could not accept being replaced. This was real. Valdris Kane was alive. He had orchestrated Celine's infiltration. He had bought Aldrich. He had planted his child inside the Blackthorn Palace and was using the kingdom's own obsession with bloodlines to hand himself the throne through a ceremony that the entire council would execute willingly because they believed they were securing the future when they were actually surrendering it. Luna folded the letter. She stood. She walked to the war room where Riker was reviewing the final deployment plan with his lieutenants, and she placed all 3 documents on the table and said nothing because the documents said everything. Riker read them. His lieutenants read them. The room was silent for a long time. Then Riker looked up at Luna with an expression that had passed through surprise and anger and arrived at something beyond both, a cold, operational focus that meant the time for analysis was over and the time for action had begun. "When?" he said. "Tomorrow," Luna said. "The ceremony is tomorrow." Riker turned to his lieutenants. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The room snapped to attention the way a blade snaps to its edge. Instant, total, the collective response of people who had been trained to move when their alpha moved and think later. "Full deployment," Riker said. "Northern column through the Ashfall Pass. Southern column through the river corridor. We move at nightfall, and we hit the capital at dawn. The objective is the Great Hall. The ceremony starts at midday. We need to be inside the walls before the first drum sounds." He looked at Luna. "You know the way in," he said. Luna nodded. "The drainage tunnels under the eastern wall. They were built during the first Blackthorn dynasty for sewage and overflow. They are wide enough for single-file movement, and they exit inside the palace compound, behind the kitchens. I used a similar route the night I reached Celine's door." Riker studied her face. Not her plan. Her face. Reading it the way a man reads terrain before committing troops, looking for weakness, for doubt, for the hairline fractures that mean the ground will not hold under pressure. Whatever he saw, it satisfied him. "You lead the tunnel approach," he said. "My people do not know those walls. You do." It was not a request. It was not a compliment. It was a tactical assessment delivered by a man who measured people by what they could do under pressure and did not waste time on feelings about it. Luna met his eyes and felt the weight of what he was asking settle onto her shoulders like armor. Heavy, constraining, but solid. The weight of responsibility. The weight of being necessary. A weight she had not felt since the day Kael stripped her authority and turned her from a participant in the kingdom's future into a spectator of its destruction. She was not a spectator anymore. They moved at nightfall. 200 Shadow Fang fighters split into columns and vanished into the forest like dark water flowing downhill. No torches, no drums, no banners. They moved by starlight and memory and the particular night vision that comes from living in a forest so dense that the difference between day and night is a matter of degree rather than kind. Luna rode with the southern column, Riker beside her, his fighters arrayed behind them in a formation so tight and so silent that she could hear the snow compressing under hooves, but nothing else. No voices, No metal clanking, no sound that would carry beyond the tree line. They reached the eastern edge of Ashenmere 2 hours before dawn. The city was quiet. Winter quiet. The kind of stillness that settles over a place when the temperature drops low enough to make the air itself feel thick and reluctant, like the world has decided that movement is too expensive and has gone still to conserve what little warmth remains. Smoke rose from chimneys, street lamps flickered. The palace walls loomed against the pre-dawn sky. Massive, dark, the same walls Luna had looked out from 100 times and was now looking at from the outside with the eyes of someone measuring them for breach points. She led the tunnel team, 30 fighters, handpicked by Riker for close quarters work. They left the horses with the main column and approached the eastern wall on foot, moving along the frozen riverbank where the drainage outlets emptied into the water through iron grates that were old and corroded and had not been maintained since before the war, because nobody maintains the parts of a fortress that they have forgotten exist. Luna found the grate, third outlet from the south corner. She had marked it on her map from memory, and the memory was exact. The same warped iron bars, the same cracked mortar, the same gap at the bottom, where the freeze-thaw cycle had loosened the stone enough to create a space that a person could squeeze through if they were willing to lie flat in 3 inches of frozen sewage and did not mind the feeling of iron scraping their back. She went first, because going first was the only way to prove to 30 Shadowfang fighters that the tunnel was passable, and because leading from behind was for people who valued their survival more than their credibility, and Luna had stopped valuing her survival the moment she understood that survival without purpose was just a slower way to die. The tunnel was exactly as she remembered. Narrow, dark, the walls slick with ice and something organic that she did not want to identify. She moved on her hands and knees, the ceiling so low she could feel it brush the top of her head, the air thick with the smell of cold stone and stagnant water. Behind her, the fighters followed in single file, silent, professional, their breathing controlled and their weapons strapped tight to prevent any sound that would echo through the stone passageway and alert the guards above. They emerged behind the kitchens. The pre-dawn light was gray and thin, filtering through clouds that hung over the city like a ceiling made of ash. Luna crouched in the shadow of the kitchen wall and listened. Guard patrol. 2 men. Moving along the inner wall from south to north, their bootfalls crunching on the frozen gravel of the courtyard. She counted the rhythm, timed the gap, waited until they passed the kitchen corner and their footsteps faded toward the north wall. "Move," she whispered. They moved. 30 fighters flowing across the courtyard like shadows spilled from a bottle, fast and low and utterly silent, taking positions behind the structures that Luna had identified on her map. The stable block, the armory wall, the storage building adjacent to the Great Hall's south entrance. Within 3 minutes, every position was occupied and every sight line was covered, and the palace guard had not noticed anything because the guard was facing outward, watching for threats from beyond the walls, and the threat was already inside. Luna positioned herself beside the south entrance. The twin doors were closed. Through the wood, she could hear the sounds of preparation, servants arranging furniture, the clink of metal on stone, the low murmur of voices organizing the space for the ceremony that would begin in 6 hours. She pressed her palm flat against the door. The wood was cold, solid oak, the same doors she had walked through 1,000 times as queen, the same doors that had closed behind her when she was escorted out of her own life. She felt the grain under her fingers and the cold seeping into her skin and the hard, fast drumming of her heart against her ribs. And she thought about the woman who had last touched these doors, the broken, grieving, terrified woman stumbling through a snowstorm with torn pages in her boot, and she barely recognized her. That woman had been surviving. The woman standing here now was not surviving, she was arriving. There was a difference, and the difference was teeth. Riker's northern column hit the outer wall at dawn. Not an assault, something quieter and more surgical. His fighters scaled the wall at 3 points simultaneously, using climbing irons and the kind of patient, methodical vertical movement that suggested they had been scaling fortifications in the dark since before most of them could shave. They neutralized the wall sentries without sound, not killed, restrained, gagged, bound, and stashed in guard alcoves where they would not be found for hours. The wall was secured in 12 minutes. The gate mechanism was under Shadowfang control in 15. By the time the sun cleared the eastern ridge, the palace was surrounded, the walls were held, and every exit was covered by fighters who had been waiting in position so long the frost had settled on their shoulders like epaulets. The palace did not know. That was the most remarkable part. The ceremony preparations continued, servants bustled, council members arrived in their formal robes. Guests filed into the great hall through the south entrance, passing within feet of the 30 Shadowfang fighters concealed behind the storage building, and they did not see them because people do not look for wolves in the henhouse. They look at the fence, they look at the gate. They assume the interior is safe because the walls are high, and that assumption is the oldest and most fatal mistake in the history of fortifications. Luna waited. The morning crawled. She could hear the great hall filling, the rising volume of conversation, the tuning of instruments, the particular buzz of anticipation that precedes any event where power is about to change hands, and everyone in attendance wants to be close enough to feel the shift. Midday approached. The drums began. The same deep ceremonial boom that Luna had heard on the morning the feast was announced. The sound that meant something official was happening, something that could not be undone. Riker materialized beside her, quiet, sudden. The man moved like smoke. "The northern column is in position," he said. "Gates are ours. Walls are ours. Thorn's guard does not know yet. When they figure it out, we will have approximately 10 minutes before they organize a response." 10 minutes, Luna calculated. The ceremony itself would take 15. The formal declaration, the presentation of Celine, the council vote, the public acknowledgement. If they interrupted before the vote was formalized, the recognition had no legal standing. If they were even 1 minute late, the child would be officially entered into the Blackthorn registry as a royal heir, and unwinding that through legitimate channels would take months, months that Valdris Kane would use to consolidate power and eliminate anyone who opposed him. "We go when the drums stop," Luna said. "The drums end when Kyle begins the declaration. That is the moment every person in that hall will be focused on the throne platform. That is the moment the guards will be watching the crowd instead of the doors. That is our window." Riker looked at her, and in his eyes she saw something she had not expected. Not the cold operational focus of a military commander, but something warmer and more complicated. Something that looked like the expression of a man watching someone become the thing they were always meant to be and recognizing, with the quiet certainty of a person who has seen enough of the world to know what matters, that the transformation is real. "Stay close to me," he said. It was not a command, not protection. An acknowledgement that what was about to happen would be chaos. And in chaos, the only thing that keeps you alive is the person beside you. And he was choosing to be beside her, and she was choosing to let him. The drums stopped. The silence that followed was enormous. The kind of silence that fills a room when 400 people hold their breath at the same time because they know they are about to witness something that will change the shape of their world. Luna could feel it through the oak doors, a pressure, a density, the collective anticipation of an entire kingdom focused on a single point in space and time. "Now," Luna said. The doors opened. Not gently, not ceremonially. The 30 Shadowfang fighters hit both doors simultaneously, driving them inward with a force that echoed through the great hall like a cannon shot, and Luna walked through the opening into the light of 400 torches and 400 stunned faces, and the sudden, violent rupture of everything the ceremony was supposed to be. The great hall was exactly as she remembered it. The throne on the northern wall, the council seats in their semicircle, the public gallery packed with lords and ladies and merchants and military officers, all dressed in their finest, all turned toward the throne platform where Kael Draven stood in his formal armor with the Blackthorn crown on his head, and Celine Voss beside him in white silk and gold, her hand resting on her belly, her face frozen in the act of smiling at a room that had just been invaded by the woman it had discarded. Luna walked up the center aisle. Shadowfang fighters flanked her on both sides, weapons visible but not raised, a statement of force, not an act of war. The distinction was deliberate. Luna had insisted on it. This was not a coup. This was a correction. And corrections required witnesses who could see clearly, which meant the weapons stayed sheathed until someone gave them a reason not to. The hall erupted. Screams, shouts, council members rising from their seats, palace guards drawing swords and then hesitating because the fighters in front of them were Shadowfang. And Shadowfang had a reputation that preceded them the way thunder precedes lightning. And hesitation in a room full of drawn weapons is the space where intelligence lives. Luna kept walking. Her eyes were on Kael. Only Kael. The man on the throne platform who was staring at her with an expression that she catalogued in the time it took to cross 10 feet of stone floor. Shock first, then confusion, then something that looked like fear, and underneath all of it, buried so deep she almost missed it, a flash of something that might have been relief, as if some part of him, some remnant of the man who had once grabbed her face on a battlefield and called her the only thing worth burning for, had been waiting for exactly this. For someone to stop the machine he had set in motion, for someone to walk through those doors and force him to look at what he had done. Luna reached the base of the platform. She stopped. The hall was still screaming, but the sound had retreated to a distant roar, like listening to a storm from inside a cave, because her focus had narrowed to the 3 people on the platform and the space between them and the documents in her hand, and the next 60 seconds that would determine whether this kingdom survived or consumed itself. Kael spoke first. His voice cracked through the chaos with the trained authority of a man who had commanded armies. "What is this?" he said. "Guards, seize—" "I would not finish that order," Riker said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. Riker Vale stepped forward until he was standing beside Luna at the base of the platform, and the quality of his presence, the sheer physical weight of a man who had spent 20 years being the most dangerous person in any room he entered, changed the mathematics of the moment instantly. The guards who had been moving forward stopped, not because they were afraid, because they were smart enough to calculate odds and experienced enough to know that the calculation did not favor them. Kael's eyes moved from Luna to Riker. The Alpha King's jaw tightened. His hand moved to the sword at his hip. Instinct, reflex, the muscle memory of a man who has spent his life solving problems with steel. "You bring the Shadowfang into my hall," Kael said. His voice was low. Dangerous. The voice of a man whose authority is being challenged in front of every person who matters and who understands that the next 30 seconds will define whether that authority survives or shatters. "You bring an enemy army into the heart of Blackthorn during a royal ceremony. They are not the enemy," Luna said. Her voice cut through the hall like a blade through silk. Clean, final. The voice of a woman who had spent 7 years learning how to be quiet and had just discovered that the quiet was over. She climbed the first step of the platform, then the second, then the third, until she was standing on the same level as Kael and Celine and the throne and the crown and every symbol of the power that had been used to destroy her. Celine's face was a study in controlled panic. The smile was gone. The warmth was gone. The carefully constructed mask of graciousness and maternal glow had cracked, and underneath it Luna could see the real face. Hard, calculating, the eyes of a woman running through options at machine speed and finding, for the first time, that none of them led where she needed them to go. Luna looked at her. Really looked. The way she had wanted to look at her since the night of the feast, when Celine had sat in her chair and smiled her stolen smile and dared Luna to object. Then Luna turned to the hall, to the council, to the 400 witnesses packed into the gallery who were watching this moment with the paralyzed fascination of people who understand they are seeing history happen and cannot decide whether to run or stay. She held up the documents. "This woman," Luna said, pointing to Celine, "is not carrying the Alpha King's child." The hall went silent. Not the ceremonial silence from before. A different kind. Deeper. The silence of 400 people simultaneously realizing that the ground beneath their feet might not be solid. Luna continued. Her voice was steady, each word placed with the deliberate precision of a mason setting stones. Celine Voss was not in Greyhallow during the siege. She was not dead. She was not missing. She was in Ironfang territory, with Valdris Kane, the Alpha who swore to destroy this kingdom. She unfolded the first document and held it high. A sworn statement from a merchant in Greyhallow confirming she was never there. A buried intelligence report documenting her crossing into Blackthorn from Ironfang territory 8 months ago. And a letter, written in Valdris Kane's own hand, addressed to your chancellor. She pointed at Aldrich, who had gone the color of old wax, outlining the entire operation. The pregnancy. The ceremony. The gold transfers through the treasury. The plan to place Valdris Kane's child on the Blackthorn throne through your own laws and your own obsession with bloodlines. She dropped her arm. The documents hung at her side. You were not crowning an heir tonight. You were surrendering your kingdom to the man who tried to destroy it, and you were going to do it willingly because you wanted so badly to believe in a pure alpha bloodline that you forgot to ask whose blood it actually was. The silence held for one more second. Then it broke. Aldrich bolted. The old chancellor surged from his seat with a speed that no one expected from a man his age and made for the side exit behind the council chairs. He got 4 steps before 2 Shadowfang fighters materialized from the shadow of the gallery and caught him by both arms and brought him to his knees on the stone floor with a sound like a sack of grain hitting the ground. Celine moved, fast. She spun toward the back of the platform, toward the private exit behind the throne that led to the royal quarters, and from there to a dozen possible escape routes that Luna had mapped 4 days ago in a tent in the northern forest. "Kale," Celine said. Her voice had changed. The honey was gone. The warmth was gone. What remained was sharp and raw and desperate, the voice of a woman whose operation has just detonated around her and who is reaching for the only tool she has left, the man she has been manipulating for weeks. "Kael, she is lying. This is a coup. She brought an enemy army into our home. You cannot believe—" Kael did not move. He stood on the platform with his hand on his sword and his crown on his head and his eyes fixed on the documents Luna was holding, and Luna watched the truth hit him the way she had watched avalanches hit the northern valleys during the war. A slow, terrible cascade that starts with a single crack and ends with the entire mountainside coming down. She could see it happening in real time, the denial collapsing, the excuses crumbling, the elaborate structure of belief and desire and political convenience that he had built around Celine's story. The story he needed to be true, because the alternative meant he had exiled his wife for nothing, betrayed his queen for nothing, stripped the one person who had never lied to him of everything she had earned, all of it coming apart in his eyes like a building losing its foundations. "The blood test," Kael said. His voice was quiet, almost inaudible. The microphone of 400 witnesses should not have been able to pick it up, but the hall was so silent that his words carried to every corner. The blood test showed alpha markers. Luna looked at him. She felt something move in her chest. Not sympathy, not forgiveness. Something more complicated than either. The ache of watching a man you once loved finally see the thing you have been trying to show him, and knowing that the scene has come too late to save anything except maybe the kingdom, and maybe not even that. "Alpha markers," Luna said. "Not lineage markers. Your healer told me the specific bloodline test was suppressed. Ordered not to be performed. The test confirmed the child carries alpha blood. It did not confirm whose." Kael turned to Celine, and the look on his face, Luna would remember it for the rest of her life. Not anger, not the righteous fury of a king who has been deceived. Something worse. The look of a man who has just realized that every decision he made in the last month was based on a lie, and every person he hurt was hurt for nothing. And the wreckage is too vast to comprehend and too complete to repair. "Celine," he said, one word. Her name. Spoken with the flat, devastated finality of a man laying a body in the ground. Celine's face contorted. The mask shattered completely. And what came out was not the measured voice of a political operative or the honeyed tone of a seductress. It was something raw and primal, the sound of an animal that has been cornered and knows the cage is closed. "You think you won," Celine said, looking at Luna. Her hands were on her belly. Her eyes were wild. "You think walking in here with your documents and your soldiers changes anything? Valdris has been planning this for years, since before the war ended, since before your precious king even knew my name. The armies are already moving. The Iron Fang is not some broken clan hiding in the wastes. They have been rebuilding, rearming. They have allies inside every kingdom between here and the eastern coast. And this," she gestured at the hall, at the stunned council, at the crumbling ceremony. "This was just the quiet way, the clean way, the way that ended without blood." She paused. Her breath was ragged, sweat on her forehead despite the cold. "You just chose the other way," she said. The horn sounded from beyond the palace walls before Celine finished speaking. Not a blackthorn horn, not a shadowfang horn. A sound Luna had not heard since the darkest days of the war. The deep, guttural blast of Iron Fang war horns that had once echoed across the western reach while 2,000 wolves died in the mud of the Red Valley. Riker was already moving. He crossed the hall in long strides, barking orders to his lieutenants in a voice that was no longer quiet or measured, but hard and fast, and carrying the electric urgency of a man whose tactical calculation has just been rewritten by an enemy action he did not anticipate. Luna ran to the great hall window. She pressed her face against the glass and looked out at the capital of Ashenmere and saw what Celine's warning had been building toward. An army, coming from the east, moving through the outskirts of the city in a dark, organized wave that flowed between buildings and over barricades with the coordinated precision of a force that had rehearsed this approach on terrain models and was now executing the real thing with the confidence of soldiers who believe the battle is already won because the element of surprise is on their side. Iron Fang banners. Hundreds of them. Maybe 1,000 fighters. Moving toward the palace walls with siege ladders and battering equipment and the kind of heavy infantry that you bring when you are not trying to sneak inside, but trying to break through. Celine was right. This had always been the backup plan. The ceremony was the first option. Quiet, legal, bloodless. A transfer of power wrapped in tradition and sealed by the council's own votes. But Valdris Kane had not survived exile by relying on a single plan. He had built a second option. A violent one. And Luna's interruption of the ceremony had triggered it. Riker reached her at the window. He looked out. His face went hard in a way that Luna had not seen before. Not angry, not afraid, but focused with the particular intensity of a man who has just calculated the odds and found them worse than expected, and is now deciding not whether to fight, but how to fight in a way that keeps the maximum number of his people alive. "How many fighters do you have inside the walls?" Luna said. 200, Riker said. "Against what looks like 1,000, and my main force is positioned for an infiltration, not a siege defense." Luna turned from the window. Her mind was already working. The same cold, rapid processing that had kept her alive during the war. The same pattern recognition that had found the gap at Ashfall and the weakness in the northern pass and the drainage tunnel she had led 30 fighters through 4 hours ago. She looked at the hall. 400 civilians, council members, lords and ladies, palace staff. The public gallery packed with people who had come to witness a ceremony and were about to witness a battle. She looked at Kyle. The Alpha King was standing on the platform with a shattered expression and a sword he had not yet drawn, and the ruins of everything he had believed scattered around his feet. She looked at Riker, the Alpha who owed this kingdom nothing, who had refused to fight in the war that built this throne, who had every reason to take his people and disappear into the mountains and let Blackthorn burn the way its enemies had always wanted it to burn. But he was not leaving. He was standing here, in a hall full of people who called him traitor and coward and enemy. Standing beside a woman who had walked into his camp 5 days ago with blood on her face and torn pages in her boot and nothing to offer except the truth and the stubborn refusal to die. The horn sounded again, closer. The palace walls shuddered as something heavy hit the eastern gate. A battering ram. The first impact of a siege that would breach the walls within the hour if nothing changed. Luna looked at Riker. "Can your people hold the walls long enough for me to evacuate the civilians through the western tunnels?" she said. Riker's jaw tightened. He looked at her, and in that look she saw the question he did not ask. Why? Why save the people who abandoned you? Why bleed for a kingdom that erased you? Why put your body between danger and the same crowd that clapped while your life was dismantled in front of their eyes? He did not ask it because he already knew the answer, because the answer was standing in front of him in the form of a woman who had lost everything and gained something that no crown or title or ceremony could provide. The understanding that strength is not what you take from the world, but what you give to it when it gives you nothing back. And that understanding was written in every scar on her body, and every decision she had made since the night she climbed a staircase in the dark and chose the truth over her own safety. "We hold the walls," Riker said. He turned and was gone, moving through the hall, his voice rising above the chaos, his fighters responding with the instant, trained precision of a force that had been built for exactly this. Not ceremony, not politics, but the raw, grinding, bloody reality of a fight that mattered. Luna turned to the hall. She raised her voice, not the voice of a queen, not the polished, modulated tone she had used in council chambers and feast halls, and the careful, curated public appearances that made up the performance of royal life. Something rawer, something that came from the place inside her chest where the old Luna had died and the new one was still learning to breathe. "Everyone," she shouted. "Western tunnels. Now, move." The hall moved, slowly at first, then faster, the crowd surging toward the south entrance where Luna's fighters were already opening the doors and directing the flow of panicked bodies toward the western wing and the tunnel network that ran beneath it. Council members, lords, ladies, palace staff, soldiers who had been guarding a ceremony and were now part of an evacuation, all of them moving past Luna, around her, through the space she had cleared, and some of them looked at her as they passed. Quick, startled glances. And in those glances she saw the thing that hurt more than the exile, more than the betrayal, more than the hand on her throat in the forest. They saw her. For the first time since Celine walked through those gates, the people of Blackthorn looked at Luna Morel and saw her. Not the discarded queen, not the political inconvenience, not the woman who had been erased and replaced and forgotten. They saw the person standing between them and the thing that was coming to kill them, and the recognition in their eyes was worth more than any crown because it was earned, not inherited, not bestowed, not dependent on a man's decision or a council's vote. It was hers. The eastern wall shuddered again. Dust fell from the ceiling of the great hall. The torches flickered. Somewhere beyond the walls, steel met steel, and voices rose in the ancient, terrible harmony of combat. And Luna stood in the center of the emptying hall with the sound of war in her ears, and the taste of dust on her tongue, and the absolute unwavering certainty that the next hour would determine not just whether this kingdom survived, but what kind of kingdom it would be if it did. Kael appeared beside her. He had drawn his sword. His crown was gone, knocked off in the chaos or removed deliberately, she could not tell. His face was stripped of every mask he had worn in the last month. What remained was raw, broken. The face of a man standing in the wreckage of everything he built and finally understanding that the wreckage was his fault. "Luna," he said. She looked at him. The man she had married. The man she had followed into war. The man who had held her face and called her the only thing worth burning for, and then burned her instead. "Not now," she said. Then the eastern wall breached. The sound was catastrophic. Stone and iron, and the roar of 1,000 voices pouring through the gap like water through a broken dam. The Iron Fang army hit the palace compound in a wave of dark armor and war cries, and the specific primal violence of soldiers who believe they are winning and want to make sure the victory is total. Luna drew the blade from the sheath on Kael's belt, a short sword, not his primary weapon, light enough for her grip and sharp enough to matter. He did not stop her. She turned toward the eastern wall. She could see them through the great hall windows, fighters scaling the rubble, pouring into the courtyard, meeting the Shadowfang defenders in a clash that turned the frozen ground into a canvas of blood and steel and the desperate, grunting, ugly reality of close combat. Riker was in the courtyard. She could see him through the chaos, a dark figure moving through the fighting with the controlled, devastating efficiency of a man who had been training for violence his entire life and had made peace with its costs a long time ago. His blade caught the morning light in arcs that left bodies on the ground and space around him that the enemy learned quickly not to enter. But there were too many. Luna could see the numbers. The math was brutal and simple. 200 Shadowfang against 1,000 Ironfang, with the walls breached and the compound filling with enemy fighters, and the only thing between the invading army and the 400 civilians evacuating through the western tunnels being a line of defenders that was bending and would eventually break. Kael moved past her, toward the courtyard, toward the fighting. His sword drawn, his armor catching the light, the Alpha King of Blackthorn walking into the battle that his own blindness had created with the expression of a man who knows that the only apology worth offering is written in blood and is prepared to write it. He hit the Iron Fang line like a hammer hitting glass. Whatever else Kael Draven was, liar, fool, the man who threw away the best thing he ever had. He was an Alpha King who had won his throne through combat, and the muscle memory of that victory was still in his body. And he fought with a ferocity that cleared a 10-foot radius around him in the first 30 seconds and drew the attention of every Iron Fang fighter in the courtyard toward the man with the crown mark on his brow and the killing stroke that had ended the last war. Luna did not watch. She turned to the western wing. The evacuation was still in progress, civilians streaming through the corridors toward the tunnel entrances. guided by Shadowfang fighters and palace guards who had put aside their confusion about whose side they were on and defaulted to the only priority that mattered, getting innocent people out of the path of the killing. She ran, through the corridors, past the tapestries with their silent queens, past the kitchens and the armory and the stairwell where she had collapsed and cried in the dark a lifetime ago. She ran toward the western tunnels, checking every junction, directing every straggler, her voice hoarse and her body screaming and the short sword in her hand throwing light against the walls as she moved. She reached the tunnel entrance. Civilians were flowing through, hundreds of them, terrified, stumbling, some carrying children, some carrying nothing, all of them moving with the blind, desperate urgency of people who understand that the world above them is ending and the only direction that leads to survival is down. Luna stood at the entrance and counted them through. Every face, every body, making sure the flow did not stop, did not bottleneck, did not collapse into the kind of panicked crush that kills more people than the thing they are running from. The palace shook. A sound like the world tearing. The second wall had breached. The compound was being overrun. She could hear the fighting getting closer, the clash of steel, the screams, the heavy thud of bodies. And she knew with the cold certainty of a woman who had read 1,000 battle maps that the corridor she was standing in would be reached within minutes. The last civilians passed through. Luna turned to follow them into the tunnel. Then she heard it. A voice, small, terrified, coming from the corridor behind her. Please, someone. Please help. A child, somewhere in the palace above her, trapped, alone, left behind in the chaos. Luna stood at the tunnel entrance. Safety was 10 steps below her. The fighting was closing in from the east. The child's voice echoed through the stone corridor like a bird trapped in a cage, and every second Luna stood here deciding was a second the distance between her and the Iron Fang vanguard shrank. She looked down the tunnel, dark, safe, the direction every rational calculation pointed. She looked up the corridor, bright with torchlight, loud with war, the direction that might kill her. There are moments when the person you are and the person you are becoming stand face to face, and the distance between them is a single choice. And the choice is not between good and bad or smart and stupid, but between the version of yourself that survives and the version that deserves to. Luna turned away from the tunnel. She ran up the corridor toward the voice, toward the fighting, toward the fire, with the short sword in her hand and her heart slamming against her ribs, and the absolute ferocious certainty that this moment, this choice, this act of running toward danger for a child she had never met in a kingdom that had thrown her away, was the thing that made her worth saving in the first place. And behind her the tunnel gaped like an open mouth, and above her the palace burned, and somewhere in the courtyard Kyle Draven fought with blood streaming down his face, and the weight of every mistake he had ever made driving his blade into the bodies of the enemy he had invited inside his own walls. And somewhere in the northern corridor, Riker Vale held a line that was not going to hold much longer. And somewhere in the great hall, Celine Voss stood alone on an empty platform with her hands on her belly and the ruins of her operation crumbling around her and the sound of the kingdom she tried to steal tearing itself apart. And Luna ran. The child was underneath a collapsed tapestry frame in the corridor outside the royal nursery. A boy. 6, maybe 7 years old. The son of a kitchen maid, Luna would learn later. A woman who had been among the first to evacuate and had turned around in the tunnel to find her son gone, pulled from her hand by the crush of bodies, swept backward into the palace like a leaf caught in a current flowing the wrong direction. Luna found him by sound. His crying had thinned to a whimper by the time she reached him, the particular exhausted sound of a child who has screamed until screaming no longer works and has downshifted to the only thing left. Small, broken noises that are not meant to be heard by anyone, but are simply the body's way of refusing to go silent.